our table right there. Well, we got all kinds of cups in there.
Supposed to speak to you about getting on the list.
Oh, to speak? Yes. Yeah, you just fill one of these out. Yep, and then you just give it to me.
We'd like to call this morning's policy session to order. Madam Clerk, could you call the roll, please?
Mayor Ardis.
Here.
Councilmember Ali. Councilmember Sear. Councilmember Grab. Councilmember Jensen. Councilmember Kelly. Councilmember Montalongo. Councilmember Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Euler. Councilmember Riggenbach. And Councilmember Ruckriegel. You have a quorum present, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We'd like to invite everyone to join us and stand for a moment of silent prayer or silent reflection, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. That was not the Holy Ghost. Mr. Manager, maybe before we start, I can just maybe set the stage just a little bit for the discussion today. So, in the council pretty much knows this, but for everyone, this is really the first step in this discussion that we're going to go through to determine how we're going to address the new state law. Staff's going to and has done a pretty good job of framing the issues up. We're going to give direction back on what type of additional information we need. There will be no votes taken today on whether or not we're going to allow this, not allow this, if it's going to be in a particular area. All those things are going to be discussed today, but there won't be any votes towards that will determine a final action today. So and I expect that we will, but if the council would like to direct staff to hold public hearing or hearings so other people in the community that weren't able to participate or listen in today, that's our prerogative to do that, and I'm sure we will do that. But so in terms of the public, there's going to be plenty of time for input and questions. So today, in a policy, it's council and staff interaction. So if there's any comments that the public would like to make at the end of the meeting during Citizens to Address, you'll have 5 minutes to make a comment. It's not a Q&A, it's a comment. But again, there will be plenty of time for public interaction at public hearings that will come up down the road. I would also encourage you, if you have additional questions, to work them through your council member or myself, and we'd be glad to help you find answers for those as well. So, Mr. Manager, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What you have in front of you as far as the packet of materials that we've given you is you have the council communication, you have an adult use cannabis summary that came from the Attorney General, as well as two documents, one from the Illinois Municipal League, which is on their website, which is Adult Use Cannabis Resources, which is just their look at the current law as it currently stands. And then from the International City County Management Association, there is a document that is the local impacts of commercial cannabis. There is a copy of the presentation that we're going to walk through today. Assistant Corporation Counsel Chrissy Peterson is here to walk through that, and I want to thank her for putting together not only the presentation but the council communication as well. We also received some information from Monica Hendrickson from that Naperville is taking up, which has a report from Colorado that we'll share as well with you later on, and we'll make sure that we get all of this information. We'll set up a splash page on our website so that we'll set that up so that we can have all of this information out there for the public to look at as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to our Deputy Corporation Counsel, Chrissy Peterson.
How about now? Okay. The new law that's going into effect January 1st is about 600 pages long. So if anybody would like a copy, we'll be happy to provide one. But we thought today we would give you the sort of the 10,000-foot overview to get you started on some of the important discussion points. And so we're going to talk through briefly what cannabis regulation is allowed by the state, what business prohibitions are possible, some ideas on zoning, some possibilities on taxes, a quick touch on employment matters. There are some equity pieces in this bill, and one of those involves expunging a substantial amount of records throughout the state for cannabis possession. We'll look at our existing ordinance. We'll talk about the equity provision in the new law for applicants, and then some potential follow-up legislation that we're expecting. So to give you the 10,000-foot overview of where we are in Illinois and how we landed here, in 2013, the state passed an ordinance which was intended to be a pilot program to allow for medical cannabis. And it allows Illinois residents who have a qualifying condition to register with the state in order to obtain cannabis for medical use. It started out as one of the most restrictive throughout the nation. We only had 12 qualifying conditions. That has now been expanded to 35, and that allows qualifying patients to purchase 2.5 ounces, which is actually about 70 grams of medical cannabis from a dispensary every 14 days. What I think is important to note is there's often a misconception that medical cannabis is a prescription, and it is not. The physician that is treating that individual either certifies they have the condition or that they do not have the condition. And once you have that certification, you can go to the state and then apply for a license, but it is not a prescription. I think the other important thing to note is when you look at the conditions that have been added, PTSD far exceeds all the other conditions combined for what patients are purchasing medical cannabis for. Just a few statistics because I thought you might be interested to know, dollar and cents wise, where this is landing in Illinois. Statewide, there are a little over 80,000 qualifying patients. In Peoria County, we have about 392 qualifying patients. There are 55 dispensaries statewide. There is one dispensary here in Peoria. And interestingly, as of the end of 2018, there were 736 patients registered to the Peoria dispensary, which, as you can see, far exceeds the number of eligible patients in all of Peoria County. So it means that people are coming into the dispensary here in order to fulfill those needs. Now, the numbers are a little skewed because a patient can change their registered dispensary once every 24 hours, so it is a bit of a moving target, but that's where the statistics landed, at least at the end of last year. And as far as what the retail sales are, through the end of July of 2019, retail sales of medical cannabis were a little over $125 million statewide. We don't have numbers for our local dispensary, but I can tell you that the dispensary in Quincy had publicly disclosed their numbers and working with some other municipalities on this new legislation. And what they disclosed was they had about 445 patients, so about half of what we see at the dispensary here. And that equivalent was $4.5 million in sales. And so that meant about $45,000 in sales tax back to Quincy, just based on the medical cannabis sales. For medical cannabis, the city's regulation is largely limited to zoning authority. Currently, they are special uses in all commercial districts, permitted uses in industrial districts, and they're prohibited in all the other districts, including farm districts. So with that really brings us to the new act that's going to go into effect January 1st. And the new law really has very little impact on the medical cannabis program, except that it took a pilot program and has made it permanent. And it also allows medical cannabis patients to have the home grow of 5 plants. Now, I was fortunate enough to speak with the owner of our local medical dispensary yesterday, and one of the questions I asked him was if he thought this law would have an impact on the amount of business that they do. And he didn't anticipate such because it is a bit difficult to grow these plants for medicinal purposes at the strengths needed for medicinal purposes, and so they weren't necessarily expecting a decline in revenue based on this. So for recreational use, so there's sort of where we've been with medical cannabis, and now here's where we are with recreational. The new law allows adults who are over 21 to purchase cannabis for recreational use, but it is subject to some limitations. And they broke that out by resident versus non-resident. If you're a resident, you can have 30 grams of the cannabis flower on you. Non-residents can only have 15 grams. A concentrate, you can have 5 grams or 2.5 grams, and the THC level in your products can be 500 or 250 milligrams, depending on if you're a resident or non-resident. Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. The other big question that most municipalities are running into and asking is, once you purchase this product at a dispensary, where can it be used? And the act really anticipates that it's going to be used in private residences. Now, there is another provision in the bill that allows for on-site consumption at a cannabis-related business. So a dispensary, for example, could have, say, a tasting room or the equivalent of a cigar bar for what we have in Illinois now. It also anticipates that other businesses that aren't cannabis-based, so whether it be a local bar or a lounge that would be for cannabis consumption only, can purchase a license and be licensed by the city for on-site consumption of that product. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about zoning, but it does create an interesting conundrum that, for example, a bar could seek a on-site cannabis use license from the city and allow smoking of cannabis, but not allow tobacco to be smoked because of Smoke-Free Illinois. Because they wrote a provision in the act that said, if you obtain a local on-site consumption license, you are going to be exempt from Smoke-Free Illinois. So you have the potential throughout Illinois to be able to go into a bar and people won't be able to smoke cigarettes, but would be able to smoke cannabis. Whether or not that really happens is, remains to be seen, but that is the potential that they set up with the scheme. where can't you have cannabis or use cannabis? Use is going to be prohibited in any public place, so a street, a park, a riverfront, those are going to be prohibited. Any motor vehicle on school grounds, except for a medical user. A child who's on a school ground, there has been a new provision that a parent is allowed to go treat the child with that remedy at school. Near someone under the age of 21, near an on-duty school bus driver, police officer, firefighter, or corrections officer, and then any person, business, or landlord can prohibit the use on private property. Another interesting provision in the law, there are no home deliveries, so no Uber deliveries of the cannabis can be made. And you are allowed to actually possess the cannabis in your motor vehicle, but only if it's in a sealed, tamper-evident container. So no use in the vehicle, but you can have possession in the vehicle. The city could, if they chose to, adopt an ordinance that prohibits the sale of recreational cannabis altogether within the city limits. And one thing we would ask you to think about is that that would have, literally no effect on the existing medical cannabis dispensary, except the licensing scheme that has been set up in Illinois allows existing medical cannabis dispensaries to really be the first wave of applicants. And they can now actually submit applications for an early use adult recreational license. They would also be entitled to obtain a secondary site license not more than 1,500 feet from their existing facility. So Illinois anticipates that these medical dispensaries will obtain the recreational use licenses, those first 55, and they will be selling both medical and recreational out of their current storefronts. They also anticipate that they may very well set up a second site very nearby that would also sell recreational. No, they would still be allowed to sell medical cannabis, but the state anticipates those initial 55 medical dispensaries will be the ones that are going to sell recreational.
If I could just remind everyone to speak into the microphones. Use the microphones, please, to speak in so everybody can hear.
In addition to the first 55 licenses and the secondary licenses that we're anticipating for the medical facilities, Illinois is going to issue 75 adult use dispensing licenses before May 1st of next year. Now, when they divvied up the medical licenses, they did it by state police district. For the, we'll say, the second wave of recreational licenses, they're doing it by Bureau of Labor Statistic districts. So that means that within Peoria, Marshall, Stark, Tazewell, and Woodford County, there will be 3 additional adult recreational use licenses issued. This is on top of the medical dispensary licenses. But because
Quick question.
Illinois, I'm sorry.
Under the list of, oh, sorry, go right ahead.
Can I get, okay. Because Illinois allows it, it doesn't mean that you have to allow the sale of it within the city limits. So locally, Morton and El Paso have both already adopted ordinances banning the sale of recreational use. Up north, Libertyville, Bloomingdale, Grays Lake have all adopted ordinances banning recreational use. And Naperville's kind of bounced back and forth. They had a vote that was somewhat tied when they took an original sort of straw poll of the council, and now they have an ordinance coming back in September for a formal vote to ban recreational use. Did you have a question, Councilwoman? Okay. Mm-hmm. I believe it's just one in Tazewell and one in Peoria. Yes. If East Peoria chooses to allow the recreational sale, it would be 5, yeah. That is the expectation, yes. Yes, sir. Yes. Because it is an opt-out, we don't necessarily have a list of communities that we know for sure are going to allow it. There's lots of discussion, and if you, a quick Google search or looking at the municipal league, we tried to find a list of communities that were definitely in, and we couldn't yet find one. Everybody is either currently in discussion or anticipating more public hearings in September, but there wasn't an available list of communities because it's an opt-out, not an opt-in ordinance. Because you don't have to opt in, you just have to opt out. We didn't have a good data source to tell you who for sure was on board with this. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Delavan has a cultivation center, and so they are in works of expanding that cultivation center because they're expecting production to obviously increase substantially.
Christy, if there's any deadline we need to be aware of?
Well, obviously the new law goes into effect January 1st, so we would hope that we had clear direction and ordinances in place by that time.
Are there any areas in our city that currently we could bring in this regulation come January 1st would automatically be able to go in without coming to council, or does every area of our city will be required to come in for some type of special use?
Because it's not regulated at all in the ordinance now, what we certainly don't want to happen is that people get licensed by omission. That the council, say, for example, took no action on putting this in the zoning code, and somebody were to go apply for a license. It's not allowed, but it's not prohibited, and assume for some reason the state gave them that license. We could very well see ourselves facing a legal challenge of, did we license it by omission? Was it legal? Was it not legal? So we are recommending that we have a firm yes, no, as far as whether or not we're going to allow this in the codes.
Chris, excuse me, Counselor. When you talk about the business prohibition, is it possible for the city to allow the sale, but then limit the places where it's used?
Yes. If you allow the sale, you do not have to allow on-site consumption at a cannabis business or a non-cannabis business. So they are really two separate issues and would be zoned potentially separately.
Actually, we're just getting ready to go into the zoning part of your presentation, so some of these questions will be answered here in a second. I just need to remind everybody to please use your microphones so everybody else can understand. Thank you.
So obviously, we're not looking for council to take a formal vote today on how they want to move forward, but the initial question really is, does the council want to adopt an ordinance that prohibits the sale or production of recreational cannabis? Because if it looks like we're not going to allow the recreational sale, then we don't need to worry about zoning and business licensing. But that really is going to be the threshold question that we're going to have to look at. So the rest of the presentation somewhat assumes that we're going to allow it. and we'll take a look at some of the zoning questions. It was a perfect segue into
Counsel,
it.
can I just clarify that just a little bit? Your statement isn't 100% accurate.
Okay.
Going forward, I mean, by going forward, we're not saying that we're automatically going to do it, but I think that to have all the information that we need, whether to say that or not, that's the reason we're going forward, right?
Oh, thank you. I just meant the rest of the presentation.
Right.
There's an assumption that we would want to learn the rest of the information.
Right.
So what the zoning laws in the new regs are going to allow you to do are adopt reasonable zoning restrictions for cultivation centers, craft growers, dispensaries, infusers, processors, and transporters. And I'll explain what all those are in just a second. That means we could adopt things like time, place, and manner restrictions, limit the number of licenses, and put minimum distances between these businesses and areas that the Act call areas of concern or sensitivity. So a school or a daycare is anticipated. We would anticipate wanting to zone these generally through a special use permit, not necessarily making it a permitted use in any of the districts. So that we have an idea of what all these new things are. A cultivation center is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to grow the cannabis. The craft grower is really a smaller version of the cultivation center, so consider it like a craft brewery that you might see in the alcohol industry. The dispensary is really like the pharmacy. An infuser, this is a new definition that we have in this act, is somebody that incorporates the cannabis into the products. So because edibles will be allowed, this could be a bakery, for example. A processor is going to extract or incorporate the concentrate because the concentrate is a separate process from just the infusion process. You can infuse a product with the cannabis flower, and that is separate from the extraction process that really makes more of like a gummy, sticky honey or butter substance. And then the transporters are going to be allowed to transport it throughout Illinois, even on a federal highway. And there's a provision in there that also allows a community college that has a transportation or truck driving type program to sort of get their foot in the door and use that as a training mechanism for some of their students. One thing I will note about the act is there is already a couple of regulations on the dispensaries. The state says they are allowed to be open from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and they can't be located within 1,500 feet of each other. The question that we started to touch on earlier, the city can regulate the on-site consumption of a cannabis business, and that can be done in another cannabis business or in a non-cannabis business. So the bar example that I gave earlier. And again, the interesting thing about that is a non-cannabis business that allows on-site consumption is presumed exempt from smoke-free Illinois. So again, that odd situation where you could have, for example, a bar where somebody could smoke cannabis but not necessarily smoke a cigarette. And initial recommendation would be that we do this if we're going to license on-site consumption through some sort of special use.
Chrissy?
Yes.
This is the second time you've said that, and I'm not quite clear. If there's a bar where cannabis is legal to smoke, you said it's exempt from smoke-free Illinois. Does that also mean that tobacco can be smoked there?
If it was a bar, yes. But if we were setting up a separate cannabis-only lounge, perhaps no.
Of course, but, okay, just to make that point clear. Thank you.
It's just one additional question on that. So if we go back to the old days of smoking, there were smoking areas and non-smoking areas and restrictions placed on that. Is it anticipated that there would be such sort of designations, or those would be within our determination, or is there a difference, I guess, also between open-air businesses such as golf courses versus enclosed areas?
It would have to be limited to businesses that are geared at 21 and over only, because the recreational cannabis can only be used by someone over 21. So although we don't anticipate a golf course wanting to allow it, we did have to think somewhat outside the box and think consumption isn't just smoking anymore. Consumption is oils or lotions, so you could have perhaps a physician or a massage therapist that wants to somehow incorporate that into their practice for their patient, and so that is another possibility where that would also be considered consumption. We did try to do a quick look at what Colorado has done with the idea of a consumption lounge. And these weren't necessarily facilities that had liquor licenses, but were set up strictly for the consumption of cannabis. And after 5 years, Colorado just approved the concept in May. And when you look at the public debate in Colorado, they finally went this way because they found that so many people were coming to Colorado to participate in activities legal in the state of Colorado. But then there wasn't a place for them to go to safely use the product without the fear that they would then be arrested, because they weren't perhaps in a private residence, and maybe they were staying in a hotel where it had been prohibited, or they were forced to use it in the car where they weren't supposed to be using it. So after a lot of debate, Colorado has just adopted this, but it did take them 5 years to get there. Las Vegas jumped on board right away in May and said they also want to do this, but the state of Nevada pulled them back a little, and they aren't going to allow any cannabis venues to open until at least 2021. So we were able to find 9 cannabis lounges in the U.S. The majority of those were all located in San Francisco. And then one had just opened in Denver, and then there's one in Oakland. So we didn't have, other than California, a good sense of how the public was going to react to these. San Francisco we couldn't really find any issues where they had with their public consumption lounges. One thing I did want to point out is sort of looking at the map, thinking about what happened in Colorado and their debate about people coming into the state to use those activities that are legal and perhaps not legal in surrounding states, and why they went the route they did, was to look at where Illinois is. And Michigan actually approved recreational cannabis in 2018, but they're very delayed in getting their regulations out, and so they've yet to have any recreational sales. So Illinois is going to be one of the only states in the Midwest, and you can see really we have a lot of states that border us that aren't going to allow this activity, where we could see a lot of people coming from out of state into Illinois to partake in these activities. Whether or not this would be such an issue in Peoria versus one of the border cities, we don't know yet, because we don't know what sales are going to be or where sales are going to be. But I thought it was interesting to take a look at the map and see where we're at in the Midwest. So as we move through this, one of the things we'll be asking the council to focus in on are, do you have thoughts on what some of the reasonable regulations the council wants to adopt for a cannabis business, that being the dispensary? So do we want to restrict them to special uses, not permitted uses? Do we want to limit the number of licenses? Do we want to restrict the location in regards to schools and daycares? Those would be the kinds of things we would be coming back to you with in model ordinances. The other big question is, does the council want to look at allowing the on-site use of cannabis? Do you want to allow this in just a cannabis-related business if you do allow it, or are you looking at allowing it in another establishment? That's a big question.
We could allow dispensaries, but not allow on-site consumption, correct?
Correct.
I just want to make sure the public understands that.
Yeah. Just because you allow the recreational sale, there is nothing that automatically obligates you to authorize a business to obtain a license for on-site consumption. And on-site consumption is almost completely going to be regulated and allowed by local municipalities.
And so they can't, a current adult use can't go ahead and do that, even if we don't have an ordinance in place?
Correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure. So we have more time if we want to think about that. The January deadline is really for
I think January is critical for the recreational sale. If you want to look and have more time to sort of work through on-site consumption, or maybe even take some time to see
How
if you were
others
going
do
to
it.
allow sales, how that went, you would have time to authorize that later.
So
Thank
the
you.
recommendation, if hypothetically we allowed recreational, we would have to say we don't allow on-site until we have time, like some of the other states did, to figure it out. I mean, if we don't address it, then it could happen, right?
Well, it would be.
Potentially, if we didn't say it can't happen, it may. So, I mean, I think that's
We
one
could.
we have to keep in mind. Or, on the other extreme, we say we're not going to allow recreational sales in the city. People will still legally have recreational marijuana in our city and have to comply with the license. They're just not going to be able to buy it here. Right?
Correct.
Okay.
If I could follow up. So because of the way the state law is, it's going to be legal.
Yes.
In Illinois, it's January 1st, so anybody, whatever that limit is, will be able to possess it and use it in their own homes in all the places except the public places that you listed.
Yes.
So I guess where I'm going with it, but you can't have a business for on-site consumption unless the city allows it.
Yes.
Okay.
And that was a very good point.
But if we don't include that in whatever action we take now, it still won't be permissible unless the city says it is, to have a business for on-site consumption.
It wouldn't be permissible, but we wouldn't have anything in the code that necessarily prohibited it either.
So you're recommending that we make a decision on that as well at this point?
If we can.
At that time, yeah.
Okay.
The money. Cultivators are going to pay a tax of 7%. So the growers are going to automatically pay a tax of 7% on what they sell to the dispensaries.
I have a question on the cultivators, because we've only talked about dispensaries. Under the new law, are there going to be more licenses for cultivators as well? Because I know those initially were limited to a certain number in the state, and I believe there was only 1, 2, or maybe 3 in our police district.
That is an excellent question. We do anticipate more cultivation centers. I don't recall how many they're going to be. Let's see if I can find that quickly.
And currently, we don't have a cultivation center in the city of Peoria.
Correct.
And I don't know even whether there's a potential location or if that's even an issue, but that might be something that we need to look at as well, if the number of those licenses are going to be allowed or expanded.
I'll follow up on the cultivation centers and get you some more information
Okay.
on that.
Thank you.
Council, additional probably follow-up question is how that 7% is broken out. I mean, does that all go to the state? Is there a trickle back to us? Do we know?
It's all going to go into the Cannabis Regulation Fund.
Okay. So we don't get a penny of that.
We will get 8% back to 8% of everything that goes into the Cannabis Regulation Fund is going to go into LGDF.
Okay.
So we would get our proportionate.
Distributive
Share.
through LGDF. Gotcha.
Yes. So, and I'll talk a little bit about the state taxes. So 7% is the cultivation tax. The purchaser tax is actually broken out by the level of THC. So if you buy a product that has THC below 35%, you're going to pay a 10% state tax. Above 35%, you're going to pay a 25% tax. And if you're buying an infused product, you'll pay 10%. All of those funds, again, are going to go into the Cannabis Regulation Fund. And for a bit of background of where all of that money is going to get distributed, 35% of that is going to go into the state's general revenue fund. 25% of that is going to go into the Criminal Justice Information Projects Fund for what they're calling the R3 program. And this is one of the equity components. That is the Restore, Reinvest, and Renew program that's supposed to address economic disinvestment, violence, overuse of the criminal justice system. That is going to be for areas that are defined by the state that meet that criteria, and that will make that 25% will become grant funds for economic development, violence prevention, re-entry programs, youth services, and civil legal aid.
Counsel,
So is,
who determines what percentage of THC is in the product? Does the cultivation center or the distributor need to have a lab on site?
No, when they purchase the product for sale, they will need to know the level of THC, so the dispensaries will have to confirm that information with the cultivation centers.
So the cultivation center will have to have some type of lab on site?
And they already do for some initial testing.
Thank you.
so are those taxes for both medical and recreational, or are they just the recreational piece
This
and the
is
medical?
just the recreational piece.
Those areas, those social equity target areas, have they been defined?
They've been defined in just the terms I used, economic disinvestment, violence, et cetera. The state is going to develop a cannabis advisory board that will determine which areas of the state meet that criteria. And then those are the areas that will become eligible for the R3 program grants.
Okay.
There are some additional grant programs that are going to be available, though. So 35% of the state tax dollars are going to go to general revenue. 25% is going to go to the Criminal Justice Info Projects Fund. 20% is going to go to the Department of Human Services for abuse and prevention programs. 10% is going to go into Illinois' budget stabilization program. 2% is going to be dedicated to a public education campaign, and then the remaining 8% is what will go to LGDF. 35% is going to go into the general revenue fund for the state. 25% is going to go into the Criminal Justice Information Projects Fund for the R3 program. 20% is going to go to the Department of Human Services for abuse and prevention. 10% is going to go to budget stabilization. 2% is going to go to the public education campaign, and the remaining 8% to LGDF.
Eight
8%.
Is this on? Okay. The 8% that goes back to the local government, is there any qualification in that distribution based on whether or not cannabis is legal in that jurisdiction? Or sale is legal and growing is legal?
No, even if the city decides to prohibit recreational sales, that 8% will go into the LGDF regardless of which communities opt out.
If I could, in the Attorney General's summary that is right after the council communication in your packet, the question about who regulates THC that Councilwoman Moore had, it's the Department of Agriculture that will be regulating that. And the answer to Councilwoman Jensen's question about the wave of additional licenses is on page 4 in that document. And there's listed there the different types of businesses and when those additional licenses will be rolled out. So it's in the Attorney General's summary on page 4.
And I think the Department of Agriculture currently regulates the medical facilities,
You're welcome.
the cannabis, or the cultivation centers for the medical part as well.
So in the timeline, just in terms of the rollout of additional licenses statewide, is May 1st of 2020, there's awards for licenses of up to 75 new dispensing organizations. July 1 of 2020, the Department of Agriculture will award up to 40 licenses for infusers and up to 40 licenses for craft growers and licenses for transporting organizations statewide. Wave 2, there will be another 110 dispensing organization licenses awarded by December 21st, 2021, and then 60 additional licenses for craft growers, and then 60 additional licenses for infusers and transporting organizations by December 21st, 2021.
It doesn't list cultivation centers, though.
So it doesn't, that's a good question. look back.
So you'll still follow up on that?
Yep.
Thank you.
So that's how the state taxes are
Can
going
I
to work.
have one more follow-up on the cultivation center? Can you also find out if the municipality can tax, or if there's a limit on how much we can tax cultivation centers? Like we're allowed 3% on dispensaries, but I'm wondering if we're allowed to also implement a tax, and if there's a limit.
I'll take a look. Councilwoman Jensen already stole my next slide. She said that the city can impose a maximum 3% tax on the recreational sale. It has to be done in 0.25% increments. Now, keep in mind, though, that if you were to allow recreational sales, and if you were to tax it at 3%, it is actually slightly more than 3%, because you still get your 1% of the state sales tax, and then you would get your home rule sales tax. So your 3% is actually more of like 5.75%. And again, we don't have any definite numbers or estimates of what recreational sales are going to be. But because we know that the medical dispensary in Quincy was doing about $4.5 million for medical sales, and we have about twice as many patients, I was able to speak with the owner of our medical cannabis facility yesterday, and we agreed that we thought $10 million was a reasonable estimate to use, just to ballpark figures here today, for what you may see at the end of the first full year of sales. And so if we were to have $10 million in recreational cannabis sales in Peoria, if you adopted a 3% sales tax, that would be the equivalent of about $575,000 in new tax revenue. Yeah. If in the first year of sales, Peoria had $10 million in recreational cannabis sales, your additional tax revenue would be $575,000. Now, we have no way to know what the sales are going to be. It could be half of that. It could be twice as much as that. But based on medical cannabis sales, that is our best reasonable estimate of what we can give you for any sort of projection. Now, I do want to point out that Representative Gordon Booth was part of the task force that got this bill passed, and recently they issued a task force toolkit to local governments. We haven't seen it yet. We really just read about it in the news. And they are cautioning local governments to not tax this at such a rate that is going to prohibit sales. Now, mind you, the state's not ramping up their sales tax over time, but they are encouraging municipalities to consider ramping up their sales taxes over a period of time, because the caution is that they don't think the program will be at full capacity for 5 years. So we may be receiving that information. I just happened to catch a news blurb about it yesterday that the founders of the bill and the people that worked for passage of the bill are issuing this local government toolkit. I don't think we've quite seen it yet, though.
Council, the maximum is 3%, but does that mean you can come out of the gate at 3? I'm looking at the item below. It says adopt in 25% increments. So are we required to start at 25%?
No, you could come out of the gate at 3, and that is what Chicago is considering. And a quick search of what we're seeing people pass, the village of Sheridan, and I'm not even entirely sure where that is looking at adopting 2%, but everybody else that's in discussion has really started at 3.
The 0.25% increments just means you couldn't adopt 8 and 1.7, or 1.17% tax. It has to be in 0.25% increments, and that's for the ease of administration, just setting that up.
This goes against my prejudices, but I think one of the reasons why the state is leery of people going to 3 is because the tax will be so high that the current illegal market will be maintained at a much lower cost. I think that's really the state's concern, rather
That is
than
exactly the
rather
state's
than what they
concern,
say.
That the news articles on it suggest that if they can't keep the overall tax rate under 30%, now mind you, if somebody's buying a product that has THC above 35%, they're already going to pay a 25% tax to the state. And then if you added on the city's 3, you'd be pushing that 30% pretty quickly. They're saying if they can't keep the tax rate under 30%, that the illegal market is exactly that, going to be cheaper to purchase it. I don't know what the going rate is though, so I can't give you any numbers. I guess we could ask the police chief, he might know. So the big question next to if you want to allow it will be at what rate, and are you looking at 3% out of the gate? Would you want to look at a graduated scale? What sort of tax would you want to place on this project? And we'll certainly look at the taxes on the cultivation center and follow up. Nothing in the act from an employment side for the city prohibits the city from having a reasonable drug-free workplace policy for either disciplining or terminating an employee for a violation. Now, interestingly enough, though, the act does amend the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act, and it prohibits the city from taking an adverse action against an employee or an applicant based on his or her use of products outside of work that are lawful under state law.
I was just wondering how does that comport with a blood test that shows that you've got, cannabis stays in your system for a long time?
It does.
How does that comport with current kinds of blood tests, hair tests, all that stuff?
If we were a private employer, we would probably advise that any pre-employment testing for cannabis should be ceased, because I cannot use that as the sole factor to determine if I'm going to hire someone or not. However, we are a public employer, and because we have dollars that flow from the federal government, we are subject to the federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. And as we know, cannabis is still illegal on the federal level. And almost all of our grants that flow from the federal government, if not all of them, require certification that we have a zero tolerance policy at our workplace. So Illinois has set us up for a conflict between federal and state law, because I have a state law that tells me I cannot take action, I cannot discriminate against an applicant or an employee based on their use of a lawful product. But the federal government has told me, if you want to continue to receive your federal dollars, you have to have a zero tolerance policy regardless.
My question was thank you for that info. My question related to private employers. It seems like there seems to be a contradiction in my mind between not being able to discriminate, and yet you can still have prohibition, and I don't understand.
Well, for a private employer, the law is very clear with this new act that if somebody were to do a pre-employment drug screen and test positive for cannabis, that could not be the only factor that was used to determine to hire somebody or not hire somebody, or if it was a random test for employees to discipline those employees, if it was cannabis. Now, if other substances come up, that's a different story, right? Because those are still going to be illegal. But if cannabis showed up, a private employer could not use that as a basis to make an employment decision. Not all private employers are subject to the same federal regulations that we are, however, because of our grant dollars.
And is that in all lines of employment across the board, or are there certain ones that have been carved out that are still, I guess, what would be considered under the old regulation?
Yeah. I can't say I spent a ton of time looking at private employment, so there very well could be for safety-sensitive type positions. If you're running a nuclear power plant, maybe that's going to be exempt. Because we're not a private employer, I didn't spend a ton of time on it.
Council, does the federal approach to employment matters, as you've described, also follow federal funds that are used on projects and contracts? So would that employment requirement and approach, I should say, follow the federal funds that the cities receive and give out to when we have RFPs for different contractual things that we buy and services?
That is an excellent question, and I don't know off the top of my head if our contracts require it. Do you happen to know, Ross?
Thank you. I can speak just to the federal funds that we receive through HUD, so approximately $2.5 million. A lot of those funds are distributed to subgrantees, either social service agencies or to contractors who are carrying out programs on our behalf. All of those contracts that we have with the subgrantees do carry forward the drug-free workplace, federal drug-free workplace requirements.
So I could anticipate some problems where a contractor or subcontractor, a contractor, let's say, receives funds and determines that some subcontractor, makes some judgment that some subcontractor was ineligible, and how is that going to be, how do we vet that issue? Oftentimes in diverse selections of subcontractors, there are issues that arise that suggest that maybe it was because of that particular subcontractor. So I would be interested to learn how we would monitor that type of process. Not here, but if that's something we can follow up on.
That's an excellent question. We'll follow up on that because I'm curious myself now to think about how we're enforcing drug-free workplace policies with contractors and subcontractors. So we'll try to get you some more information.
Thank you.
This is going to be an issue regardless if we allow the sale in our municipality or not, right?
Yes.
Because this is going to be an issue that every single municipality that takes federal dollars is going to be facing. So is it possible, I guess at this point it's impossible to even speculate how this would be enforceable on either the federal side or state side, so.
I think in the private sector, you are seeing employers start to prepare for this by amending their policies to recognize that they will not be able to use really a cannabis test, a blood test, to make an employment decision. So I think we're seeing changes on the private side. On the public side, we also have to remember that the majority of our employees are covered by collective bargaining agreements that have very detailed provisions for drug testing policies and drug-free workplace policies. So we are continuing to work through our policy, look at our collective bargaining agreements, and look at our existing drug-free workplace policy. At this point, we haven't identified any changes that we're going to recommend, but we are continuing to work through those with HR and talk to some other industry experts to see if there's going to be any guidance for public employers on really how we're going to deal with this.
Know yet how those education dollars will flow to the states? I'm imagining a situation where, John Smith comes to the workplace from his home where it's legal to smoke there, and maybe he has an adult son who's 25 years old and living in the basement, and he smokes kind of regularly. And John Smith comes to work and he kind of smells of marijuana. And everyone looks at John and says, but he's not partaking. And so once we find out how those educational fund dollars can flow to the state and how we then need to start getting information out, maybe that would be the health department that the funds would flow to, and they would have an educational campaign, because I can see a lot of issues arising from that.
I can tell you that the city's policy now, unless somebody is pulled for a random test or there's an accident, is really about, is there a suspicion that that employee is impaired? Not necessarily that I smell an odor, or somebody's eyes look a particular way. It's really, is there something about their behavior that's showing impairment where we have a concern that we need to move forward with? Yes, Councilman?
On our emergency responders, there are certain protocols already in place,
Yes,
and they would remain in place.
yes.
And impact, federal government still has it as what, a level 1?
Yes.
And so if one's crossing a state line and one is not in a state where we have rather liberal policies as relates to it, they could be subject to, and they should be aware of it, some pretty draconian consequences if they're in a state where this is not the case. That's because the federal government still considers it level 1.
Yes.
Thank you.
One of the other diversity pieces, in addition to how some of the funds are going to flow from the state tax dollars, involve expungements of records. And the city will be required to automatically expunge the arrest that didn't lead to conviction for possession or manufacture or possession with intent to deliver for up to 30 grams of cannabis. Those cannot be associated with a violent crime or have been sold to a minor. And the state gave us a very detailed timeline for when those records have to be expunged. We have some time to do that. So we have a 7-year period of records that have to be done by 2021, 13-year period that has to be done by 2023, and then any records prior to 2000, we have until 2025 to expunge. And that is a process we will start to work with the police department on to figure out the correct method for those expungements.
I have a question. If a record is expunged when someone lives in Illinois and they move to another state where they do not have the kind of arrangement we have, would that expungement be honored?
An expungement is an expungement, and so the record shouldn't even show up in another state.
Only because I do a lot of expungement
Yeah.
pro bono work. There's kind of a misconception out there when you say it's expunged. All the records are destroyed, but there's still a record at the courthouse. And law enforcement, the state's attorney office, the FBI, they still have access to that record if it's in their capacity of their official duties. So I don't think the general public is aware of that. But it would be expunged for all the other states if anything happens. But there's still a record of it at the local courthouse. And then most of the crimes that are expunged, they're actually really sealed. Most convictions, even with the expansion in the state law, are only allowed to be sealed. There are certain requirements that have to be met.
May an employer get to the
And
records
sealing
that
actually
are
means,
still extant, or they have to be sealed for them?
say that again.
If they're sealed, let's say I apply for a job somewhere, would the prospective employer, if I have a
There are
conviction-
some authorized employers that have access to sealed records, and those would be, typically it's employers like school districts or park districts that have certain other requirements. If employees are going to be working with children, they have the authority to see if there's a criminal sexual assault conviction in their past, things like that. And there's some other exceptions under the law for authorized employers.
May they consider that then in their hiring decisions?
For the certain authorized employers that are that are specifically listed in the state law.
Even if a misdemeanor?
I don't know. It would depend on what the exact charge is and what the circumstances are, I believe.
So it could be hanging out there still.
Well, it's sealed, but only authorized employers have access to it under certain circumstances.
So Caterpillar might not have access to it.
Correct.
I just making them as an example.
Statewide, they're saying that there will be around 800,000 arrest records that are going to be eligible for expungement. They can be expunged if 1 year or more has elapsed since the date of arrest and no criminal charges were filed, or they were dismissed, vacated, or the individual was acquitted. Keep in mind, these are just related to the cannabis offenses that are under 30 grams.
Do you have an estimate of how many records the city will have to expunge automatically?
We don't. The only estimates we can find are statewide.
Is that going to require extra staff?
I'm going to look at the police chief for some direction.
Yes, Councilwoman. We're currently in the process of hiring another records tech position, and that person's primary responsibility will be expungements.
Okay. Do you have an idea, like a ballpark number of
I
how
do
many
not.
records? Okay. Thank you.
But you can tell us what the records tech position salary with benefits that's the starting cost for the city, what that would be.
Yes, I'll be able to forward. I don't have it with me right now, but I'll be able to tell you what the cost of that is. Absolutely.
Chief, other than the ministerial aspect, does the Peoria Police Department have any thoughts on this?
On the expungement part?
Yeah, well, what we're looking at potentially doing,
So as far as the
let's say we would not opt out and go toward the recreational aspect in the city of Peoria and tax it. Do we have a law enforcement position
yes,
as
from
to
a
impact?
yes, sir. From a law enforcement standpoint, I don't know if this is the time or to start getting into
It is
but-
the time.
Yes. That's what I meant, Councilman, was after the presentation or now, whatever you would like.
No, I'm happy to wait, but it needs to be discussed.
Yes, sir.
If I could just ask a question on the automatic expungement, that means we have to go through the records. This is the person who's being expunged has no responsibility on this whatsoever.
Yes.
correct?
Normally, an expungement is initiated by the person with the record, and in this case, they are going to be automatic. Now, one thing that I thought about as I was working through how the tax dollars are going to be divvied up from the state, it seems like the cost we're going to incur, at least for the next few years, as we deal with a heavy amount and number of expungement records, is that something that we could very well look to that Criminal Justice Information Projects Fund for, and hopefully that's one of the things they'll be making grant dollars available for, are communities like Peoria that have to work through a high number of expungements.
That was going to be my follow-up. Is the state providing any subsidy for this?
That's what some of that 25% that's going to go into the fund is for, is if we're identified as one of those areas, then we could look for things, grant money for that exact type of issue, I think.
Want to let you know that Representative Gordon Booth has indicated that the toolkit is available. I will forward it to our clerk, and she can disseminate it to the rest of the council.
Maybe on that note, I'll just make sure that we acknowledge and welcome Representative Gordon Booth, who's with us today. Also, our County Board Chairman, Andrew Rand, is here. This is an important issue to the county as well. And I'd also like to recognize Peoria Public Schools Superintendent Sharon Desmond-Crott, who is with us. Thank you for being here today, and also Monica Hendrickson from the City County Health Department is with us. Thank you.
Did you say Rand?
Moving on to what the city's existing ordinance says. Now, in our municipal code, in section 21-112B, it is currently an ordinance violation, and it's unlawful for a person to knowingly possess less than 10 grams of any substance that has cannabis. Anything over 10 grams is prosecuted by the state's attorney's office, but anything 10 grams or less for the past year and a half has been prosecuted by the city attorney's office as an ordinance violation. Now, as to anybody that is over the age of 21, the new state law really nullifies and makes void all of this language. But because the state law only applies to individuals over the age of 21, we are going to need to ask you to consider if you want to keep this in effect for those that are under the age of 21. We don't have the best statistics on the age for the individuals that are receiving these tickets now, and we're trying to work to pull that together. But we estimate that probably at least 0.25% are our initial estimates go to individuals that are under 21.
I have a question. Does the city actually issue very many ordinance tickets for this? Because usually isn't drug possession just done by the state?
I'm hoping to come back to you with some better statistics on that, but I can tell you that no, we don't issue a large number of ordinance violations on this. I would estimate it off the top of my head to be less than, the chief seems to have the exact number.
While he's looking for that, I will let you know, council, that I've asked the chief to come to us with information regarding that kind of thing. Folks, that a number of people have been arrested, what the cost have been, what our law enforcement additional time spent on these types of things has been. So at the end, he'll come back with all of that information.
But if you could just answer the ordinance violation question.
Yes, so for the Coven, which is a cannabis ordinance violation, in 2018, 172 Covens were issued, and in 2019, year-to-date, 125 have been issued.
Thank you.
Attorney Peterson, I'm wondering if we have here the existing ordinance, and thank you for that. I wonder if you could provide us with a copy of the existing ordinance for underage drinking. And that might be a good way to fashion something if we need to.
Of course.
I do have a question about the city. If the city were to move affirmatively on allowing this, what would happen if someone goes into the county outside the city of Peoria? What rules would adhere there?
For use, possession?
Possession, all of it.
All of the above. Well, the state law is going to apply regardless of whether or not they're in the city or the county. So they're going to be allowed to use and possess that 30 grams.
You can't change that.
If you're over 21, yes.
The city can't preempt that.
No, I realize that, but as for what we could contemplate doing to make it possible here, let's say they're in a rural part of Peoria County, they have to follow all the state laws, I recognize that. But would there be any possibility of friction in terms of what we allow in Peoria and what might be allowed in Edelstein?
There could be.
Or Elmwood? Same county.
For use,
I can give you hypotheticals, but
that may help.
maybe you can, well, I will give them to you a little later on, but I just wondered if you had a generic answer to that.
For use, the law is the law, that if you're over the age of 21, we're going to see consistency, I think, throughout the state. For those that are under 21, maybe there will be some discrepancies, because perhaps the county won't choose to write this as an ordinance violation, or perhaps the state won't choose to pursue this because of time or efficiency. We simply don't know. And we may have the communities that you mentioned very well decide that they're not going to handle it at all, whether they're over 21 or under 21. If it's a small amount of possession, under 10 grams, they're simply not going to write an ordinance violation for it. That could very well happen, yes.
Okay.
But can I follow up? Sorry. I'm having troubles with this microphone. The state, though, it'll be illegal for anybody under 21 to possess any amount.
Yes,
So-
it would just be a matter of, is a state ticket going to be issued or a local ticket going to be issued?
Right, but I mean, if we compare it to alcohol use, the state prosecutes those on their own and have for, ever since it's been 21. So I guess I don't foresee that being much of an issue.
So if we have a Morton-like community, only it's a city in the county, there's not going to be any untoward consequences any differently than what it would be in Peoria. If there's a migration outside the city of Peoria. You understand what I'm saying?
Wait, are you talking about use or dispensary?
Any aspect of it.
It's such a broad.
Where would there be a potential for strong action to occur, or maybe not so strong action, but something above and beyond what the sanctions would be in the city of Peoria and what our limitations are if they go to, let's say, community like that has this kind of regime that Morton has, only it's in Peoria County. Andrew Rand, I'm not picking on the county. I'm just asking the question. So there could be differences here.
Off the top of my head, the only scenario that really comes to the forefront would be if one is going to allow on-site consumption and one isn't. We would have to work to make sure that we're not seeing unequal enforcement for when individuals then leave those on-site consumption facilities. So that very well could be maybe a scenario you're thinking of.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Montalongo?
Yes, Corporation Counsel. So just the other day, I was at a gas station and noticed that there was a case that was selling paraphernalia, and the question just came into my mind here, just thinking, who can sell it, who can purchase it, maybe not just that, but maybe even some of the equipment that's needed to produce, as we were talking about infusers and processors. So is there any special laws and or ordinances around that now?
Until January 1st, we really shouldn't see that stuff anywhere. I'm wondering were you seeing vaping accessories?
I don't think it was
You're not
vaping
sure?
stuff, no.
The police chief has some questions for you. Yeah. Until January, we really shouldn't see anything, and I don't know if I've really seen any information on what we can expect to see sold in certain facilities as far as maybe paraphernalia, but I will follow up on that. That's a good question.
Okay.
I want to know more about the enforcement of the sale of paraphernalia. There's some establishments, I'll call them, in my district who are already and have been making these things available. And so if that's something that shouldn't be happening, I would want to ramp up before they decide that it's legal and now, it's a whole cottage industry.
We'll follow up on the paraphernalia. That was a really good question. Thank you.
And equipment. Yeah, the equipment to produce this.
Council, I want to go back to the discussion on employers and drug testing. And I thought you said that employers wouldn't be able to drug test for cannabis.
They can. It cannot be the sole decision maker for an employment action, because the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act will now say that an employer cannot take an adverse action against an employee or an applicant based on his or her use of products outside of work that are lawful under state law. So if you see somebody smoking cannabis at work and decide to have them tested, then you're not just using the test. Obviously, they were using a product at work, and perhaps use at work was illegal. So in that case, it would be justified. But maybe a pre-employment screening, where that is the only factor of whether or not somebody would be eligible to then work there or not, under the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act, would be prohibited.
Okay, and so that's in the, and do you have the citation from the act that says what you just read?
I will find it for you.
Can I
don't
get
know it off
that?
the top of my
Because
head.
I'm reading, I heard something contrary to that, and then I was reading from the fact sheet from the Illinois Municipal League under employer provisions, and it says the act provides employer protections, including that nothing in the enactment prohibits employers from adopting reasonable zero tolerance or drug-free workplace employment policies concerning drug testing and so forth. And to me, that's contrary to
It is, and then
what
they
you
all,
just said.
it also made an amendment to the Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act, and so we do have a bit of a conflict. You're absolutely right.
Okay. Can I comment on that as well? I do know attorneys that represent a lot of private employers and are advising them that they can institute drug-free workplace policies, and they're doing that, and they're planning to do that in January. So I think Corporation Counsel makes a good point that it's an area that may be litigated in the future, and it's kind of a gray area of the law because this is a new law. But I do know that several private employers are going ahead with what's in that, what that advice is coming from the Municipal League and others.
Counsel, can you tell me what is determined to be the amount of time that someone who has smoked marijuana, how long that stays in your system? So when we're talking about pre-employment interviews or testing, if someone smoked 2 weeks ago and they test a week from now, is it still in the system, and then they can be judged as ineligible to work at that place, although they kick the habit, if you will?
Unlike other substances, it is not water soluble. So it does stay in your system longer. It is not metabolized as quickly as...
Like alcohol?
Yes.
So when you say longer, I don't know how long alcohol stays in your system, but is it a day or a week or?
28 days.
Alcohol stays in your system 28 days? Oh, marijuana?
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll talk later about how you know that.
That's too quick. The other thing that we will be asking the council to think about, and it's somewhat come up already today, is whether or not we want, to consider the fact that we already license liquor sales, video gaming, and tobacco sales. So we may want to consider having some business regulations that would be the equivalent to sort of a safety or health inspection, and the act anticipates that there will be local inspections of that sort. So we will look at and make some recommendations, if the council wants to go down this route, on licensing retail cannabis stores and licensing businesses, perhaps, that offer on-site consumption. And then the bigger question will be who we want to handle enforcement and regulation of those. So if we were to establish a scheme in line with what the state allows that looks somewhat like our liquor code, would we want to hand that off to the Liquor Commission, or would we want to establish a new sort of governing body to look at those? So not asking for any direction today, but some food for thought as we move forward. And then the second to last thing I wanted to talk about was making sure that it was obvious that in this bill, they worked very hard to make sure that there will be equity in the applicant and ownership of this business. And so they created what they referred to as the social equity applicant. And that's somebody that has 51% ownership of the business that is applying for a license from the state, so for a dispensary, for example. And they came up with some factors about how they would do that. And so for 5 of the last 10 years, this individual has to reside in a disproportionately impacted area, and they gave some factors of how you come up with those areas. Or an individual that has been arrested or convicted of any offense eligible for an expungement. So if you have a cannabis-related offense on your record that is eligible for expungement, you are going to be considered or could be considered a social equity applicant. And then there are some provisions about also if you are the head of that business and you have 10 employees where 51% or more meet that criteria, well, what does that mean if you're a social equity applicant? You can have access to over $30 million in low-interest loans for the startup cost of entering the industry. You also are awarded a certain number of points on the application. There are some fee waivers, and you have 180 days to identify the location of where your business would be instead of having to identify it up front on the application.
Counsel, this only applies to individuals or organizations applying for the new licenses, right?
The new licenses, correct.
It doesn't apply to current medical dispensary license holders.
These would be for new applicants.
Okay.
And then the last piece I wanted to touch on is, this is obviously a new bill, and they worked really hard, and I think it's very thorough compared to other states, but we do expect to see some additional legislation. The Municipal League has already reached out to them to talk about the fact that there's a little bit of concern about the fact that medical users can grow up to 5 plants, not more than 5 inches, in their home for personal use, but that database is not available to our police department. So other than showing the medical cannabis use card, we have very little information to confirm who is actually a medical patient. The Municipal League is also asking for some clarification on what constitutes an unreasonable prohibition on the use of cannabis. They said municipalities cannot adopt unreasonable prohibitions on the use of cannabis, but we didn't get the best guidance on what that's actually going to mean. And then they're also asking for some clarification on the use of restricted and unrestricted funds, because the way the dollars are going to flow through LGDF and then perhaps directly back to the city, there's some confusion on what is going to be restricted for certain things and then what's supposed to come back is unrestricted dollars.
I have one follow-up on that. The 3%, up to 3% sales tax on dispensaries that's allowed, will that come to us separately from the LGDF money? Okay.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
That's my understanding, is that that comes back separate, because that's directly related to the sales that are occurring inside the municipality.
Yeah. And that is an excellent point, and so I want to make one more comment on that. I don't know if it was a typo in the bill or if there was an intent that we can't figure out what it was. It actually said that municipal taxes, we're not going to be eligible to start receiving those until September of 2020, when really the act goes into effect on January 1st of 2020. So I know a lot of the municipal attorneys are recommending that those that choose to adopt a tax on this do so and file it with the Department of Revenue as soon as possible, because we do think that maybe that will be another clarification in the bill, that that date will be backdated to January 1st. I mean, you don't want to miss out on 9 months of revenue.
On tobacco products, when the state did the prohibition against smoking in public places, and I think that's one of the last things Blagojevich did as governor. And we discussed it around the horseshoe then, whether we would do something in advance of state action, because we had concerns about smoke in restaurants, et cetera. There was no allowance made for cities to opt out. Yet the General Assembly did provide in this particular case for cannabis products the ability to opt out. I wonder what the rationale was for that, since cigarettes are also very harmful, why they didn't just apply it across the board. with no opportunity to opt out. If there was, I cannot put myself in the minds of the General Assembly, but is anybody capable of responding to that, what the reason was, if it was thought that this was particularly more insidious than cigarettes, or the federal law in reference to it? Maybe at some point we can get some answers on that.
But just as a response, we can't opt out of use. Use is permitted across the state. It'll be permitted in the city of Peoria no matter what action the city council takes.
No, but they're treated differently. Tobacco products have been treated differently than cannabis products by our General Assembly. Do you follow me?
With regards to allowing them to smoke
What happens in Peoria happens everywhere in the state as it relates to tobacco products. We have a different situation regime here with cannabis products. There must be a reason for that, and I'd like to know what it is.
Council, I do have another question. As it relates to farms, family farmers, small farmers, with what's happening with the farmers today, and their costs being impacted by tariffs and that kind of thing, I don't know where a cultivation center or grower can ply this trade. I don't know how it's grown. Is it indoors? Is it outdoors? Will those farmers be able to turn some of their fields that were growing some other product that no longer is cost effective into a section that now grows this type of product? And is there any limitation on that?
The cultivation centers are an indoor grow facility, so they are facilities that require a massive amount of water and power to those facilities in order to make that happen. Not on the cannabis side, but Illinois does have some pilot programs that they're looking at for hemp use, and whether or not they can see some productive reuse of some of these farm fields turned into hemp. That's really the extent of the knowledge I have on it.
Thank you.
So, question, and I know we've been talking about the revenue side from the city sales tax, but we don't act really in isolation. Even if we would allow additional retail sales here, that would also have, I'm assuming, another effect on our other taxing bodies, which also may have a sales tax out there as well. Would that be correct? That would be covered. So those other taxing bodies may also see an increase in revenue. It wouldn't just be strictly the revenue increase that we're talking about here for the city side.
The county can adopt its own use tax on top of the city's tax if they choose to.
So the traditional sales tax that's out there from the other governmental bodies just on retail sales does not cover this at all, correct? Okay.
I think the counties is just the unincorporated areas, if I remember correctly. So it's, the counties are just the unincorporated area. If they had, it wouldn't be over the top of the city's 3% tax. It's not countywide, so. Under
That city manager, that local taxes where it says maximum, does that include the county?
It's my understanding that the county portion of the tax, and I'll confirm this, that it's just in the unincorporated areas that they're able to impose the tax, not in cities.
Okay. Thank you.
As we're at about the end of the presentation, I believe, it was a very good opening presentation. I think it's generated a lot of additional questions, which we expected. And I also want to announce to everybody before I forget that all this information will be on our website. You'll be able to go on our website and get this information, and including is all the information.
We'll put the entire packet. Sorry, we'll put the entire packet from today online. The publications. We'll put the municipal toolkit, the PowerPoint presentation. We'll put everything out there.
So the PowerPoint presentation We didn't do a very deep dive into it, but the packet will be online, and that has a lot of really good information with some case studies of other communities that have done this, so additional good information just for consideration. Before we go a little bit farther into direction to staff, I would like to allow the privilege of the floor for our representative, Jahan Gordon Booth, who's with us today. Not to put her on the spot, but she was obviously is in leadership in Springfield, did a lot of hard work on this, and Representative Gordon Booth, just any general comments you'd like to make in regards to the discussions that we're having?
5 minutes, good. It's a challenge sitting here when this was my baby. I worked on this for 3 years, and when you have a child, any of you that have been with child know that once that child is no longer in you, you have to share it with the world. And that's happening right now, and I'd like to say that I like the fact that you all are having a conversation and you all are trying to be thoughtful about it. My hope is that we continue to have these conversations. There's a lot of context that I think that has been missed today, and that's understandable. This was a 600-page bill that folks like myself, Kelly Cassidy, Heather Steens, and Senator Toy Hutchinson worked on literally for 3 years, so it would be very difficult to know all of the ins and outs of this bill. But I do applaud you for at least opening up the conversation and having the community here. Again, my hope is that we continue to move in this vein. The aspects of this bill that have been most important to me are the expungement. Expungement, I began, and what brought me into this space was I'm not a perfect person. When I came into public office, they elected an unperfect person. And so because of that, people have always been very willing to share with me their unperfect journey. And I quickly saw that there was nowhere for those people to go. And so I began wanting to do expungement summits and working with folks like Beth and other folks in this community to provide thousands of people in this community with a second chance. And so as we began to go down the road of having the conversation of whether or not cannabis should be legal, my engagement in this process was for one reason and one reason only, is I wanted to ensure that there was equity in this process. And equity means people should not be moving forward with cannabis convictions when you literally are going to have some folks, maybe some folks in this audience, who are literally going to be selling metric tons of cannabis. Metric tons, but yet you still have people who are unable to get financial aid, unable to get housing, unable to get employment. I thought that was unacceptable. So that is why the significant expungement numbers that you see are there. Now, does that expunge everyone? No, it does not. And that caused great concern for many folks that we weren't expunging everybody, but we went as far as we could go. I think Councilman Graham asked the question, well, why did the General Assembly have the opt-out clause? Well, that opt-out clause is in there because the Municipal League asked for it. And so almost everything that the Municipal League asked for, we put it in the bill. And we did that because we felt that we wanted to be honest brokers and we wanted to try to work with communities. We know that this isn't for everybody, but this is here and it's legal and it's not going to go anywhere. And so we want folks to be able to look at this in a way that this is an opportunity. We would be, on January 1st, we will be the first state in the Midwest, and it provides significant opportunity for us to show leadership in a way that really is unprecedented because we were the first state to do this legislatively. There are 13 other states right now. I'm on the executive board for the National Conference of State Legislatures. There are 13 states right now that are seriously pushing this bill forward, and so I think it would be great for Illinois to be out front. What we do have in the medical cannabis market is the most highly regulated industry in the country. We are the gold standard in medical cannabis. When you double that with the fact that we also have the most equitable adult use recreation for cannabis, it really puts us in a strong position to be a leader, not just in the state, but a strong leader in the country. When looking at the equity components of the bill, not just in expungement, but in who has ownership in this stake, I think it's important to add that we did we did a demand study back in January to sort of assess what the current medical market would be able to supply. We thought that it was important because if you want to go into cultivation, if you want to go into a dispensary, it requires more than a year of ramp up. And so the medical industry is the industry that is going to be supplying the first wave of cannabis. A hard lid then goes onto the market, and that industry is only going to be able to supply about 45% of the market. That is being done intentionally because there is no way to ensure that there is equity as it relates to ownership if you have a huge wave that comes in and then the market share is oversaturated. And so wanting to ensure that we did this in a way that was equitable was incredibly important. So that's why there are waves. So when we talk about the different waves that are coming, the waves are specifically designated to ensure that there is an ability to go back, look at the market. If the market isn't equitable, put a disparity study on the industry. You can't do a disparity study on an industry before the industry actually exists. The medical industry exists, but this adult use recreational industry is still yet same product, but still a very, very different industry. It's different in our approach, and it's different in the way that it is being received by the community. And then I would also add, I'm coming short of my time, and I'll end on this because I'm already in the red 20 seconds.
You can go as long as you want.
The Restore, Reinvest, Renew component of this bill, we call it R3, that's going to be incredibly important to the city of Peoria and communities like Peoria across this state. In a mature market, we're going to have a mature market in 3, no more than 4 years. That's going to be $125 million that is going to be reinvested back into our communities. So when we look at sort of what's happening in 61605 and other similarly disadvantaged communities, those dollars are specifically targeted to go back towards education, violence prevention, legal education, entrepreneurship development. Those are very real dollars that have nothing to do with the larger budget that will be sent specifically to communities, to work with municipalities, to work with community-based organizations to help rebuild those communities. And to be able to do that significantly over time with a plan around how we're going to restore, reinvest, and rebuild our communities. I'm proud to be able to sit on that board. It's going to be led by Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. I'm excited about the things that we're going to have the ability to do with not only that board, but the work that we have the ability to do in terms of giving people a second chance at life through expungements and the opportunities that we're going to be, the environment that we're creating for opportunity potentially for Black and brown entrepreneurs in this space. This is, again, something that I worked for 3 years and thousands of hours on. I'm incredibly proud of this work. It is not a perfect bill. I don't think there is one. There's going to be a trailer bill that we passed this bill May 31st. On June 1st, I began working on a trailer bill. And we've been working on this trailer bill since the day that we adjourned. I'm going to be carrying that trailer bill this November in the veto session with every intention to pass said bill. So again, I'm always open for this conversation. I respect that there may be differences as it relates to this space, but I hope that we do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Gordon Booth. I've said it before and always publicly too that not just on this initiative, but this area is very fortunate to have you and your leadership representing us in Springfield, and we thank you for your time and commitment to that. So I think it probably goes without saying, and maybe just a little bit of feedback to the city manager of how we'd like to direct some public some additional public discussion on this. Oh, the chief has. Did you have something, Chief?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. During the presentation, a question got asked, and that since Ms. Peterson's done with the presentation, now I can kind of go into the details of from a law enforcement perspective and to answer a couple of the other questions that came up. So if I could, I'll answer a couple of the questions that came up. I did look up for the records tech position. The salary for the records tech 2 is $35,014. Paid into the pensions, $4,086, and then with benefits is $19,655. So for salary and benefits, $58,755 for the additional position that we're adding for the expungements. That's the person's primary responsibility will be for the expungements. Another question came up about the paraphernalia. One of the things we've addressed for years now is some of these, they call them head shops, that sell paraphernalia. As long as there's no residue inside of that object to be used, it had been smoked illegally, so there's no residue in there, they can sell them legally. So I know Councilman Montalongo had a place that's selling, call them bowls or like one-hitters. Those are legal to sell as long as there's no illegal residue inside.
Is there an
So-
age that they can sell to?
Currently, correct.
Is there an age that they can sell to?
No. No. So hopefully that answers a question regarding the paraphernalia. So then Councilman Gray brought up about the law enforcement perspective, or what law enforcement thinks. And looking at this from a law enforcement perspective, so to enforce the laws on this, law enforcement has a lot of concerns for this becoming legal. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and I've got a list of the different pros and cons and some other information I'd like to share with council because I think is important for you to be aware of from a law enforcement perspective of what law enforcement is going to have to deal with. So as far as the impact cost that's going to be associated to law enforcement, the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Boards is currently in the process of conducting a cost analysis into that, and it should have the findings in early 2020, so there are no cost analysis done at this point. Some of the pros and cons that we've seen or that we talked about, so as a command staff and as a command level officers, we had a meeting and it was like, okay, throw out your pros and cons and see what some of our challenges are going to be and some of the pros to this. So as far as under the pros, increased revenue for the city, job expansions, proven medical benefits, clear out the court system, free up time for officers because they'll not be tagging or reporting on small amounts of cannabis seized, less time for officers to appear in court, thus reducing overtime costs for court, reduce the number of arrests for minor offenses, reduce the negative opinion of law enforcement. Legalization could lessen the perception or reality of disproportionate impact on the minority community. This only affects the present time, but an arrest can have a long-term impact on employment and other qualifying quality of life factors. So just as Representative Gordon Booth had said about the expungements, so this could have a positive impact on that as well. Since cannabis would be regulated, there would be a reduced chance of other substances being mixed in with the drug, so it would have an improved quality and safety control if it is coming directly from the dispensary. Some of the cons, we've done quite a bit of research on this, and as seen in Colorado, the black market sales actually increase. So, because as of right now, there's nothing that says, all it does is say the possession of cannabis under 30 grams is legal. So it doesn't say it has to be packaged the way you bought it from the store or the way you received it. So the black market sales increase because your street level dealers, more people are going to them because it's going to be cheaper to buy on the street as what it is to buy through a dispensary. To give you an example, I spent many years working in vice and narcotics, and a ounce or 28 grams of cannabis would be right around $125 for street level value. But when you're talking dispensary, a higher level of quality, it could be anywhere from $300 on up. So almost triple the cost of what someone can purchase it off the street. Possibility of DUI accidents, and this comes back to the concern of law enforcement, is that there's a lack of equipment in order to detect DUIs. As of right now, the state of Colorado has a 5 nanogram / milliliter of THC that is permissible to be in someone's system. Anything higher than that, they would be considered DUI. So kind of like, to give you a perspective, under the blood alcohol content is 0.08 for the state of Illinois. As of right now, the state of Illinois has no guidelines set on what that limitation of the nanograms of THC in one's system is going to be. So that's definitely a concern for law enforcement. Lack of court-approved field sobriety test. We would end up processing someone. So, for example, if we have someone today that gets into an accident and they're showing signs of impairment, we would give the standard field sobriety test, and if they fail those, they would be arrested for driving under the influence. So we would use our standardized field sobriety test, but there's nothing leaning towards cannabis. We do see that it is a gateway drug into other drugs. Long-term or abusive use can be harmful to one's health. The AMA, or American Medical Association, opposed legalization due to the detrimental physical and mental effects of recreational use. Decreased mental health. Studies indicate that marijuana smokers suffer from everything from restricted blood flow to the brain, to memory loss, to the increased likelihood of schizophrenia and depression. That was written by the University of Colorado School of Medicine. And the ER visits for cannabinoid hard time pronouncing this word, I'm not in the medical profession, hypermesis syndrome have tripled in Colorado over the past 5 years. Secondhand smoke, we got to remember secondhand smoke, that can be harmful. Cannabis smoke is more harmful because it's held longer into the lungs and contains carcinogens and herbicides or insecticides. Increased complaints from non-users in public venues. What to do with cannabis when someone's arrested. So we arrest somebody, and what are we going to do with it? Are we going to take it and tag it, or does it go out to the county jail? And that's going to be conversations that we have to have with the county jail. Are they going to allow cannabis that is seized from a person, or that a person has on them at the time of their arrest? Do they want that entered into their personal property out at the county jail? Security at the vendor sites. I did have the opportunity to visit a cultivation center, and they have a tremendous security system, so that is definitely in place. But the dispensaries, so we have some concerns making sure that the dispensaries are secure. More responsibility on the police departments to purge the records, because as we talked about with the expungements. The law enforcement training on drug DUIs. As of right now, we have one police officer that is a DRE, which stands for Drug Recognition Expert. He can process a person that is under the influence of drugs. So we're going to have to expand that training. And typically with DUIs, so basic drug DUIs, when a person goes through the police academy, they get trained how to conduct a DUI. City of Peoria, in reality, the officers that come back after the academy, very seldom will a typical street officer do a DUI, so they lose the proficiency in processing DUIs. Our traffic unit, they're the ones that mainly handle DUIs, so all of them would have to get trained as DRE, and then some officers from like third and fourth shift when the traffic unit is not working. We had talked to the MTU, which is our training center out at ICC. It's about $12,000 to hold a class. They do have an upcoming class, but that is going to be their last class. The further classes, future classes, are going to be held in Decatur. So we'll have to get officers trained as a drug recognition expert. Again, as I stated earlier, no way to determine if marijuana was purchased legally or on the black market, and what will be the ramifications of the illegal sales. So, for example, if a person has under 30 grams but it's individually packaged in, say, for example, in 7-gram increments, multiple packages, you know they're selling those amounts, but what are the ramifications going to be for that? Increased usage among juveniles is a concern. So if it's more available out there, or is the increase going to go up? Possible impact on DCFS cases of cannabis use among the clients. additional costs for treatment if the usage goes up. One of the things with canines, our dog that we just purchased that is getting trained now, we do not have that dog trained in cannabis detection because we don't know where the state of Illinois is going. We do have 3 dogs that are detected, that are able to detect the odor of cannabis. So there's going to be some possible complications in future if the dog alerts on a car or a location. How is that going to look for prosecution if it was legal? So we're going to have to deal with our canines as well. Just a couple more here that I just want to cover. Potential increase in workplace accidents. Are we sending a permissive message to our youth saying that drugs are okay? And this goes back to the gateway drug theory. And how do we handle the fact that the new law conflicts with federal law? So those are just some of the pros and cons that we have discussed. And cost, Councilwoman Moore had brought up about the cost associated and what we've looked at. So we went back and pulled the numbers for 2017, 2018, and then year-to-date in 2019. And Councilwoman Moore had asked about cannabis arrests that we have made that would be legal moving forward, and compare that to DUI arrests. So in 2017, we made 215 cannabis arrests for under 30 grams. And to put a price tag on that, it would take roughly 2 to 3 hours to process a cannabis arrest. So by the time the arrest is made and then the report is written, the property is tagged, so on and so forth, roughly 2 to 3 hours. At an average of $37 an hour, those 215 arrests would have cost roughly $15,910 to $23,865 if you're looking at the high end. And sticking strictly with cannabis first, then I'll go back to the DUIs. In 2018, we made 151 cannabis arrests for under 30 grams. That would equate to $11,174 up to $16,761. Then in 2019 year-to-date, and this was researched last week, so we are up to date on that, 71 cannabis arrests have been made for under 30 grams, and that's $5,254 up to $7,881. Now, looking at DUIs, I've done just a handful of DUIs over my career, so we relied on the expert that processes DUIs, and he said that it takes about an hour and a half to process DUIs. In 2017, we had 160 DUIs, and keeping with the same number of $37 an hour, work that out to an hour and a half to process a DUI. That would equate to about $8,800 to process the DUIs in 2017. In 2018, we had 149 DUI arrests. That would be $8,195. And then so far in 2019, we've had 73 DUI arrests, which equates out to $4,015. Another question that came up was people that are currently incarcerated at the Peoria County Jail for a cannabis possession that would now be legal. There are 0. However, the jail did say that it cost about $75 per day to incarcerate an inmate, but there are currently 0 out there. So I think that answered, Councilwoman Moore, all of your questions from your email.
Yes, Chief, if you could provide that information in print, but before you do, if you could determine for the cannabis arrests, the racial division between, how many of those 215, do you keep track of that at all? of if they're African Americans, Hispanics?
We would have to go through every single report. Every report would document that, but we would have to go through every single report to determine the race of the suspect.
But you didn't have to go through every single report to collect the numbers, is that right? You didn't have to go through every single report to get to the 215 number?
Correct. We were just able to put in a broad search of it.
Do you feel that going that extra mile is cost prohibitive, would take a lot of time? I'm just asking what would be...
We could provide that.
I mean, I'm not looking forward to tomorrow or the next day.
Right. It would take some time, but we'd be able to have that.
And I would not want it to inhibit somebody else's job, but certainly as we move forward in looking at this information, I think that would be helpful to see for what has happened in the past and what we may be experiencing in the future. Thank you.
Yes.
Can that also be provided by zip code? Those violations?
They have to go through.
Yes, they could look at the
Somebody's
arrest. Yeah, somebody's answering for me. We could look at the location that the arrest is made and be able to tell where it happened.
Okay, please include that as well. I have an additional question related to the canines. Trying to understand why, if cannabis is illegal now, why would the canines have to be more prepared when it's going to be legal?
So
They're just going to be confused.
the canines are trained to detect on cannabis. It is currently illegal, so when the canine gives an alert, they're trained to detect on several different drugs, one of them being cannabis. So
Okay.
they could give an alert if there's cannabis present. When that becomes legal and the dog alerts, it could possibly be giving an alert that cannabis is present still, but now it's legal compared to illegal.
So they would have to be trained not to alert on cannabis, is that right?
You cannot pull that back. You cannot.
Okay, I didn't think
once
so.
A dog is, yeah,
Right.
once a dog's trained on that, you cannot.
Right.
That was the main reason that we got our new dog trained not on cannabis detection.
Okay. Thank you.
Chief, just for clarification, the DUI statistics that you gave us, are those cannabis-related DUIs, or are those all DUIs?
Those were, let me double check, just DUIs. That was alcohol. Those are all alcohol DUIs only.
Okay, so you're saying that we have not had any DUIs for cannabis use, as far as you know?
We had DUIs for drugs. Whether or not, all I have is DUI arrest for drugs. I don't know. It could be cannabis. It could be heroin. It's not differentiated in my numbers, but we have made DUI arrests for illegal drugs.
The info that you gave us, though, are you saying that it only relates to alcohol DUIs, or is it drug-related DUIs, or is it both?
No, it is only alcohol because that was Councilwoman Moore's question specifically related to alcohol.
Thank you, Chief.
I have a couple questions, if that's okay. First, I think you mentioned just briefly that you've done tours of the current dispensary, the medical marijuana dispensary. If you could talk about, I guess my question is, law enforcement, City of Peoria Police Department hasn't had any issues with the current dispensary in the city. Is that correct?
Correct. I have not toured the current dispensary. I went to the cultivation center, but to my knowledge, there have not been any issues at the current dispensary.
So, and they've been in business for at least over 4 years, correct?
I don't know the exact
okay.
time, but it's been multiple years.
So, and you haven't had any complaints or any arrests, and your understanding is it's regulated very well. I know some of us around the table went on a tour of it a few weeks ago, and I think you were out of town at the time. But, so I just want that, while we have the opportunity, there hasn't been any police issues, any crime issues at that location.
Correct.
And then one other item related to law enforcement that I don't think you mentioned is the use of medical marijuana in place of opioids. My understanding is that, and I'm wondering if you're aware of that and if you have an opinion on that, that it's being used rather than opioids for some things, and it's having an impact on the whole opioid problem, and it could help alleviate some of that crisis that we're seeing.
I have not heard any conversation about that. I'm not aware of any.
Okay. And then my last question, some of the points that you made with regards to the negative aspects of the legalizing marijuana, they're going to apply no matter what, because it's legal in the whole state. So whatever decisions we make here and policies we decide to adopt won't impact that negativeness is there because of the new state law.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I do have a tag on to that last point by Councilwoman Jensen. The pros and cons that you stated are pros and cons. Would it be fair to say that those pros and cons would be the same type of pros and cons for alcohol or any other drug that was being ingested? But that those pros and cons, some of them may be specific to cannabis, but not all of them. For example, you talked about impact of workplace use and how negative it would be on a person's performance. That could be said also for alcohol, for abuse of prescription drugs. Is that fair?
It's fair, but will it increase? That's what we looked at, was will there be an increase, because now you, and again, like Councilwoman Jensen said, in January we have to face this anyway, but will we see an increase in accidents because now marijuana will be legal? But yes, you're right in that it is with other drugs that are currently, or alcohol that's currently legal.
Okay, thank you.
This is a policy session, so when we ask questions, it doesn't necessarily indicate that we are inclined to do one thing versus another. It means we're doing our due diligence as a body here today. But one of the things that I had to ask myself, and I'm not necessarily requesting an answer right now, was that we're concerned about a lot of arrests for cannabis products. Why didn't we just do an expungement bill without all the rest of this? That's thought number one. Number two, we have a country called the Netherlands, which seems to be very lenient as relates to cannabis. Everybody knows that. Yet, when one goes there, one is told as a tourist that you can use that, but God help you if you use some of the harder stuff. You're going to jail, and it doesn't matter if you're an American. You're going to jail for a long time. Because we're liberal on some things, but we're not on others. And the other thought I have is, we have all these people out there wanting to sell drugs. It's a terrible, terrible street business. It does incalculable harm to our neighborhoods. And so if we're still going to have folks out there operating in the black market, trying to keep their market share as much as they can and detract what some of us might choose to do by allowing us to accrue some sales tax money off it, they're going to instead do all kinds of things with the drugs, higher level THC, try to undercut what the government, well, I don't want to say the government, but what the merchants would be selling cannabis products for. Would we be in favor of hammering them harder then going forward in the manner of, let's say, the Netherlands? Look, we are liberalizing in this area, but you people out there on the street who are going to continue to sell these drugs and who are trying to keep this market share and poison our people, in many cases the cannabis products that are being bought are laced, as the chief pointed out. Are we interested in Springfield in really coming down harder on them and putting them in jail for a long time and not worry about expungement later on for them? These are all very, very important questions that we need to answer as we try to consider what kind of city we want, what kind of community we want, and how we can best protect our population. I will tell you, Chief, that a few chiefs ago, I won't identify the chief, this was coming up, and I said, Chief, what do you think about recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois? And that chief said, well, when the police have responded and we've had a pothead, and that's all it is, they're not nearly the threat to us as somebody who is drunk. That was just in terms of police safety, police officer safety, and that's stuck in my mind, and I don't know if that's still the case or not, and I'm sure there are highly different circumstances depending on the person and their personality and so on and so forth, but it would appear that there's a lot less of a fascisty response to a police officer if somebody is just ingesting marijuana. I don't know if that's been your experience or not, Chief, and I'm not asking you necessarily to give me anecdotal, but I keep hearing that from the police officers out there.
I think that's accurate, that someone, if they're under the influence of cannabis, they're more, trying to think of the word I want to use, just, docile, compared to somebody on alcohol. Yes.
And Chief, you're going to commit, I know, your findings, what you just went over, to the council in writing, so we're going to have this. But I will just say this. We have way too many drugs out there on the street, way too much competition for market, way too much violence in this community because of it. And I'm just going to say, I want to be nice and I want to be liberal and all that, but those people who are out there still trying to distribute drugs in our neighborhoods and to our kids and everybody else, if we go with recreational, they need to be hammered. And I don't want to hear all kinds of things about how inhumane we are as a community for having consequences for people who are out there purveying this. And we need go no farther than Netherlands to see how they deal with it. And they're considered to be very liberal, but they're saying, all right, you can do this, but these other things, we are really going to sanction you. So I think we have to think about this whole thing if we go ahead and do this. And, the fact that we have a revenue component to it must mean that it's thought that maybe it will help communities make some money on something that is otherwise we're losing revenue from, but it's not going to work out too well if you're going to continue to have a thriving black market, which is one potential scenario where they're going to even have higher THC levels, and people are still going to be buying it, and we have these dispensaries operating, and for what purpose if they're not going to be utilized that much? These are all very, very difficult, and I have gone out to my neighborhood associations. I have solicited input from them, and my constituents have a lot of cognitive dissonance about it. It's not so easy for them one way or the other. And that's why this policy session, Mayor, is very important, because there are a lot of complexities to this. And we shouldn't discount the fact that pretty important decisions being made down the road. But I do understand that if we choose not to act to implement, let's say, a 3% before the first of the year, we couldn't do it if we wanted to do it until 21 versus 20. Is that correct? Hence, there is some urgency to our deliberations if we choose to do it, because if we don't do it within the window, we are possibly looking to do it in 21 if we do it at all. And then would we perhaps have other communities that would have picked up on it before us that are around us who are salivating at the prospect of being able to do it. So, manager, am I getting this correctly?
Correct. I think that the urgency is that we should have our regulations in place by the effective date of this law, by January 1st.
Okay, so if people say, well, let's just wait, let's see how it works elsewhere. Those elsewhere places may get this, and then there's nothing really, we would be left in the lurch.
In the rollout of of the additional licenses that are coming out, yes.
If I can comment too, to respond to the point that you're making, the current medical marijuana dispensary license holders are the group that's going to get the licenses first, and we have one of those in our city, but they do not have to, if the city decides not to allow it or doesn't make a decision soon, my understanding is they're being courted by other cities who want to have them pick up and move there and have his medical marijuana facility there as well as adult use.
Well, and I'm just saying too, we have an ability as a municipality to determine where this can be sold. Now, could we say that the Trinity dispensary may not be a place where recreational is sold, or does this law say, yes, that can be a place and we can't stop it because it's already been approved to do the medicinal? It's the only dispensary in the city of Peoria right now. It happens to be in my district.
Director Black?
Councilman, the council could direct staff to draw up zoning regulations that would prohibit the adult use sale of cannabis at any location, including the location where the medicinal dispensary is currently located. It really comes down to the direction from council. So, for example, the council could say that that recreational sale is only permitted in industrial districts,
right,
which would then exclude the current
Thank you. And
location.
you'll recall we had a very close vote on this, and I was opposed to that particular location because I didn't feel it should be sold just simply because it's a commercial district, that would be acceptable just because a drugstore could go there, that dispensary could go there. And I was very much in favor of, if we were going to do this, and we had no choice, that it be in an industrial area. And so, I think that the location that we could choose would not have to be in or near residential areas. Correct? We could choose industrial zone area where recreational could be acquired. Is that correct?
Correct. The council could choose simply industrial areas. The council could also add performance standards to the use. So, for example, the council could say that the use is permitted within commercial districts, but cannot be within 3,000 feet of a residential use, and therefore not all commercial districts would be eligible.
I have that. Now, if we just said it's going to be an industrial area, let's just be specific, and I'm just asking questions because it's ultimately going to come down to the details. Where in Peoria would an industrial area be? Give us a couple of examples.
Sure. So the industrial districts would either be along the riverfront, the traditional older industrial districts. There's a few smaller industrial pockets, and then the other large industrial area in the city is the Pioneer Industrial Park, Mount Holly Industrial Park, and the area to the west of Allen Road, south of the North Branch Library.
And then, of course, the question is, what's the difference? If this is basically going to be a benign thing, why should we get all hung up on that, whether it's commercial or industrial? So these are all questions that I've been running through my mind for several years now, not just waiting until this moment, which I felt was coming. So, these are all things that we do have to consider, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
To add a level of context to that, I think the other thing that we need to be mindful of is the different types of businesses that are defined in the act. You have cultivation centers, you have craft growers, you have the infusers, you have all these different types of businesses that you have to think about where you might want them to locate. So I think that's one of the other elements. It's not just thinking about the retail establishment. It's thinking about where would you want a cultivation center or a craft cultivation center to be located within the community?
So just so we don't really go a lot farther down this rabbit hole, that's not what today was about, to go into all that. It's the 30,000 foot, this is what the state allows, where do we want staff to go with this? It's going to come back to us as an agenda item for a lot more detail. So if we can not get into the what ifs right now, because I want to, we were supposed to be here till noon, and we'll go as long as we need to, but I want to make sure the citizens that came get to address us today. But in terms of that timing, and I know Dr. Ali wanted to say something too, so, let's just get it out there. I think we'd like to see public hearings on this, and in the middle of doing budget public hearings too. But if we did 3, perhaps 1, north, central, south, maybe we can work with Dr. Karat, do Manual, Peoria High, Richwood, something like that, and have our citizens have an opportunity to hear all this information. At least allow us opportunities to address and answer the ones that we can. Once you assemble that information, I think we should look to have an actual agenda item discussion business meeting on this at the latest at the beginning of October, at the latest. And I mean, because there are business decisions that are potentially going to be made over what we do or don't do. And I think back to Councilman Gray, we don't want to wait till December 29th to make this decision.
And Mayor, I'm not trying to take us down rabbit holes, but we are giving direction to staff, and there will be rabbit holes that they need to take a look at. So It's not premature, it's time. This year is flying by. We're trying to do a budget, we're trying to make this decision, and so I think as much specific guidance that we can give to staff now, the better, instead of waiting. I don't want to see the council have something come and say, well, gee, we need more time. We need to defer this. We can't defer this until the 12th of never. We need to start thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time. So this is the time to get some of these rabbit hole areas out there so staff, manager, you and your staff can be prepared to take us into the rabbit hole if we need to.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes. Oh, go ahead. Well, I think I'm next, right? So thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief, so I know we want to get to public comment. So I want to say this has been a valuable discussion, and I want to thank our city manager and council for pulling this together. It's been good information, and I'm all for the public hearings that need to take place. We need to have the public hearings and feedback and comments. But also, I think we need to supplement another meeting with some additional expertise. I would like to bring in, and perhaps Representative Gordon Booth can recommend someone, but someone with some expanded knowledge on this matter, as well as maybe someone from the Illinois Municipal League that we can ask specific questions and get some additional guidance. So I would like to have another discussion, but supplement it with some additional expertise. So, thank you.
Councilman Kelly.
Thank you. I'd also like to add to your portfolio, Mr. Manager. The information that we all received is all very good information. It has primarily to do with whether or not it's a hassle for a city to put these kinds of things into effect. It's an administrative document. The whole reason that this is controversial is because this is a public health issue, and it doesn't matter how many, what the sales tax is and all that. It does matter, but we are not talking about public health issue, especially the health of young men from ages 16, 17 to 25 who can be and who tend to be very much harmed, many of them, by this. We need to hear something on this line too. This is why this is controversial. It is not controversial because it's difficult or easy to implement. It is controversial because there's a public health issue here. So, Mr. Manager, in your reports back to us, if you could give us an overview of those issues too, which are generally unknown. And I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, I have Councilman Sear and then Councilman Ruckriegel, then
Thank you, Mr.
Councilwoman
Mayor.
Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to offer the privilege of the floor to Dr. Caraff. I don't know if she came prepared to make any statement about this today.
We're
but
going
I
to
just wanted
finish.
offer
We're going to finish and tie to council, and then we'll have public opportunities to address.
Okay.
Councilman Ruckriegel and then Jensen.
On this, just, I guess, two quick thoughts is, and I guess maybe for city manager, you could bring back a wealth of knowledge about this subject. But I think what's really in front of us today, and what's in front of us over the near side, is not rehashing the issue that was hashed in Springfield, but really what the effects of, if we zone it here, what that would be or would not be. There may or may not be an effect, because January 1st, it's going to be legal whether or not we have it zoned here. So I think we need to make sure that we stay on target of the question, because we are on limited time. And I think Councilwoman Jensen mentioned it in her comments, that if the city decides to move forward in this, and right now dispensaries are making their plans on where they are going to establish, and there is a economic piece to that, they're not going to wait until we make our decision December 31st on what they're going to do, because they are going to try to be in place early in January as possible. So the longer that we delay our conversations with the public, and I think we need to be out in the public as soon as we can to have those conversations, because every week that we wait on not making our decisions, we might throw ourselves open to having it here, and they may already be someplace else. We may have missed the boat if that's a decision that the city moves forward to. So I want to make sure that we keep our conversations really on the issues that are in front of us. And I guess with that, Mayor, we've got many citizens out here who've taken the morning to be able to address us. I really want to hear from them as well, because I think we owe them the ability to.
That's what we're trying to get to here.
Right.
Thank you.
I know we're going around here.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could real quick, I agree with Councilman Ruckriegel. I think, this is a big topic. A lot of issues have been raised, but I think if we have to separate it and focus just first on the issue of whether or not we're going to allow retail sale and the current dispensary license holder to operate here, I think that we need to focus on that and make a decision on that. The other issues, whether or not we're going to allow a cultivation center, the other items that you just mentioned, perhaps that could be done farther down the road, since we're already basically at September. We're also dealing with our budget. So that's just something that I throw out there, because I think that's important. And, some of us are talking about this in a broad sense. It's coming. It's going to be legal here in the state. So we have to decide how we're going to deal with that. And that's not just retail sale. It's whether or not we're going to have on-site consumption, which is an issue I hadn't even thought about until today when you brought that to us. And I think, you want direction now. Without getting all the input from the public, I think I would like to see us allow retail sale here, but with regulations. I think whether I want to have regulations on the type of zoning area where it's allowed. I want regulations about how far it can be from schools, from residential areas. And I'd like to keep the current license holder here because I think they have done a good job. We haven't had law enforcement issues there. They're regulating and running a very good business. There haven't been issues. So I don't want to see them leave. So that's where I'm at this point.
So as we go into citizens to address here, because this part of the conversation is ended, council should not be hesitant to get additional questions to staff that we want to come back on when we do get back together again. So I think this is a good breaking point to finish the actual policy part of this. We are in citizens to address. This portion of the council meeting or council policy session, we have 12 or so. If there's anybody else that isn't familiar with our process, you can get one of these little cards that we just need to make sure that the record reflects who spoke to us. So we would ask that we just need your name for the record. We do have a 5-minute speaking limit. Reminder, this isn't Q&A, it's just citizens to address. So we're looking for your thought process. There will be opportunities for Q&A when we do the public meetings in the public. So first, we have Susan O'Neill. Is Susan still here?
Hi, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. I have a lot to say, and so I will try to condense my first comments because I plan to attend each and every hearing that I can on this issue.
Susan, we'll reset the timer here, but just so you know, when the limit comes up, we'll stop it. So there's a timer right in front of you, so you kind of have an eye on where you're going. Okay, I just want to. I hate to cut people off in the middle, but sometimes we could have 10-minute, 30-minute, whatever it is. So we'll reset the timer, and it's all yours.
Thank you. I am a local attorney, and I'm used to these timers. I've made many appellate court arguments. I am going to urge you to have those public hearings, and I agree with Dr. Ali that we should maybe bring in some expertise here. And we have some local expertise in the people that run our dispensary. I think they could give you a lot of information that would really help you. I'm going to concentrate mostly on the ordinance, but I want to hit on a couple things. On the economic issue, the comment that if we go over the 30%, then now we're starting to maybe encourage black market sales. I believe if you talk to the dispensary that most of the products that are not infused are less than 35% THC. So that would probably mean that would be in the 10% range. So if you wanted to go to the actual 3% to make additional money for the city, I think you should ask them about what percentage of their products would fall under each one of those characteristic, classifications. In terms of zoning, I want to say that Trinity, I believe, has been a very good neighbor. And for us to suggest that if they want to open a recreational part, that now they should move out to Pioneer Parkway, I feel would be very wrong. Like to say, well, gosh, if it's working there, I don't know why the recreational wouldn't work in the central part of the city too. And somebody brought up the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, when I visited there in 1986, they had cannabis cafes, but they did not allow cannabis use in the same place as alcohol use. Just a thought. I want to speak mostly to that ordinance because, for one thing, I printed it off the website and I think there's a typo. I think it's actually 20-112, not 21-112. I am asking that you repeal that in its entirety as soon as possible. It's very draconian, and it is very unfair to most citizens. A $750 fine would be prohibitive for most people, and I know that the real question is, well, after January 1st, we can't really enforce that on adults, but we could on young people. I don't think it's a deterrent, and young people probably don't even know this law exists, and when somebody doesn't pay a fine, there are consequences. if they don't pay a fine, or sometimes they end up in jail. You know, and if they end up in jail for 24 hours or so, they could lose their job. They didn't pick up their kids from daycare. DCFS gets called. They lose both their kids and their job. They may become homeless. There are consequences to this. And I would like to see data for how the people who have been arrested for drug paraphernalia and for drug possession, these ordinance violations, by zip code, by race, because Peoria County and the city of Peoria has failed the African American community on just about every metric: unemployment, incarceration rates, homeownership rates, traffic stops. I could go on. But I believe that we need these statistics to know whether or not this ordinance is to keep going on this ordinance for the youth, or to keep going for the next 4 months on adults. I think we need those statistics to know how fairly these fines are being implemented. And in terms of employment, I'll just speak. Oh, one other thing on the ordinance. I think it's interesting that I heard on NPR this week that some jurisdictions are not enforcing different cannabis laws they have on the book because of the legalization of hemp. That's they said that for the cannabis plant is the cannabis plant. Hemp, cannabis. Hemp is something less than a 3% THC value. And what they're saying is when they pick it up off the street, they'd have to have very exact testing to determine what the THC level is. And so when you're arresting someone go back to Corporation Counsel, maybe you should answer that question. If you're arresting someone on an ordinance violation for cannabis, are you really sure you're not violating some other law, because hemp is completely legal, and the cost I've heard for doing that kind of testing is very prohibitive. So I think we need an answer to that one too. Thank you. I have more to say. I'll say it next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next, we have John Hopkins.
I didn't realize I had 5 minutes. I would have maybe written a little bit more down here. Good morning, everyone. City Council. Of course, it's a very amazing time to be standing in front of you, talking about such what I consider a momentous moment for the city of Peoria. As I mentioned, John Hopkins. I'm a local guy here. I've lived in Peoria for almost 15 years. I own several rental properties and businesses here in Peoria. I'm currently working with some other locals, and we formed a new company called Handcrafted Cannabis Company, which is, of course, what brings me here today. If the council members are like me, we've gone back and forth, and today we've done some of this in our minds. What is the best approach to the new changing law as it relates to our community? As a Christian, I've wanted to make sure to not do anything that hinders our community. And, of course, as a business owner, what is good for the community is good for me. As I consider what the impact of the community could be, I couldn't help but think of how this truly could help. Now, as it's also come up today, we know that this is going to happen somewhere, whether it's here in Peoria or somewhere else. And there will be big benefits for those communities. They'll not only receive big tax revenue, but also good paying jobs for those hired, and an influx of other revenue spent by those customers coming from out of the area. Though I would caution the overtaxing, as we talked about, pushing people back, of course, to the black market. If we could have a company of locals who are walking in lockstep with the city to have a safe, community-based cannabis business, then why not Peoria? Why shouldn't we get the great benefits and work together to cure any of the negatives? This is why I and Handcrafted Cannabis Company encourage you to say yes to allowing dispensaries, small craft grow, and yes, even lounges right here in our great community. Let's really use this law for good and create something we'll be proud of for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Anshuman Reddy. Okay. Piper Petroselli.
Morning, Council. I'm Piper Petroselli. I'm not a business owner or a big shot. I'm just a citizen that lives directly across the street here at Civic Center Plaza. If I look remotely familiar, especially to the at-large members at council, it's because I attended a lot of the candidates' forums, and I asked you all the same questions. Would you be A, receptive to opening recreational cannabis facilities, and B, what would you want to do with the revenue? I am hoping that the council will embrace what is going to be an explosive industry. I brought with me a copy of Town and Country, kind of an elitist magazine, but one of the cover stories is Etiquette for the New Pot Elite. It goes into detail, and I'm sure folks that are in the industry are familiar with the names. There are numbers of cannabis millionaires already, some of them right up in Chicago. They have publicly traded cannabis companies. They have a cannabis index. It will indeed grow with or without us. I also hear a lot of folks say, boy, there's no jobs for my kids when they graduate from college. I think what embracing the cannabis opportunities in Peoria would do would be to say to kids who go to Illinois State and they get a degree in botany, or they did get a degree in horticulture, or they did get a degree in biochemistry, come on home to Peoria. You can work at the test labs. You can work at the cultivation centers. People who have a background in law can work in all of the compliance. Not to mention, there's going to be jobs for folks who are going to build out these warehouses. And the warehouses, these are smart, thoughtful scientists. They will want to put solar on all of those warehouse roofs. If I was in commercial real estate, I would be taking an inventory of just how many warehouses I have that fit within the law that Jahan and the 4 other moms wrote. And that's where I would set up my cultivation centers. I do want to, if the council does decide to bring in consumption centers, I would also encourage them to not just think of like hookah bars, but also the bakeries and the patisseries and the restaurants, because a lot of people are cooking with cannabis, otherwise it wouldn't have its own TV show. I did ask all of the at-large candidates if we do decide to utilize these recreational opportunities, what are we going to use the money for, at least until we decide how much will be generated. I respectfully request we use that to pay down the pension debt obligations so that Peoria can breathe. In regards to the ordinance, I was kind of horrified that here we are in 2019 and it's going to be quite legal. I respectfully request that that law at least not be implemented for the remaining 5-6 months of the year for folks that are over 21, given that it will be legal in a matter of days. I'm going to leave this with the council, and I'm going to put it in care of the women on the council, because it was the 4 moms who wrote the bill, and I thought it was very thoughtfully written. But when you do see these companies that are, albeit growers or what have you, all of these millionaires are white, and they are generally men. So I do hope that when the law rolls out, Peoria will pay attention to not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, and embrace not only the economic opportunity, but all of the social equity that comes with it. Thanks for hearing me this morning.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Anthony Walraven.
Hi, my name's Anthony Walraven. I live in the 2nd District. I don't have as many fears about this as maybe some of the people you've talked to in other neighborhood associations, Councilman Graham. I was a little disappointed by a couple of things in this the way that this policy session was put out. I mean, this was essentially a presentation from the Illinois Municipal League. And the reason why a toolkit was developed by the sponsors of the bill to be presented to local policymakers was because the Illinois Municipal League's presentation kind of focuses on ways that you can like restrict this and not ways that you can make Peoria a more vibrant place. And so I emailed all of you before the meeting a copy of the toolkit. I know that Councilman Graham and Councilman Jensen got it, but that's the toolkit that hadn't been released. It was released this week, so it had already been released. So we have to be kind of worried. This will be hard for administrators to administrate because they've never done it before. But that absolutely should not be what guides your deliberations, is whether or not it makes it harder for city administrators to like administrate. What should guide your deliberations is this to be more restrictive or less restrictive on this? Is it going to be in the best interests of the citizens of the city of Peoria? So one of the things that State Rep Gordon Booth mentioned was that there is a $125 million basically reparation fund that would be used to help fund minority-owned businesses in this field because minorities have been disproportionately affected by the enforcement of these laws. If we opt out of this, that money is not available to the city of Peoria. So we're literally just taking our share of $125 million and saying no thanks because of what I feel are largely cultural hang-ups about the use of this particular substance. I live right next to Forest Hill Liquor, Councilman Graham, and I can tell you that that's a far more of a burdensome impact on the community than the dispensary that I also live right by. So it's slightly disingenuous to suggest that having loose regulations on where marijuana dispensaries can open and where use on site places can open up is going to be detrimental to the health and welfare of Peorians when we have liquor stores on every corner. And if you get into lower income neighborhoods like mine, those are some of the only businesses that are in those neighborhoods, of course, with payday loan stores and liquor stores and bars. So this is the opportunity to actually invest in these communities with money from the state to build union jobs, because almost every job that's going to be involved in this field is going to be unionized, whether it's the transportation, the cultivation, the growing in retail, the working the security, all those jobs will be unionized. And there's incentives in this package to actually hire minorities and hire people of color from these disproportionately impacted communities. I would have liked to have seen more of that in this agenda, this presentation that was presented to you. I feel like most of what was presented was, these are the bad things that could happen. These are the ways that we have to watch out for, and not, these are the really awesome ways that with no expenditure of the city's part or very little of it, we can be part of one of the largest growing industries in the United States, in the only state in the Midwest that actually allows this to happen. I don't think anyone on this council wants to raise taxes on anybody, but I would find it very disingenuous if you would turn down the conservative estimate of $500,000 to $600,000 a year on the first year, and then come back here next year and say, oh, we got a budget deficit again, we have to cut public services and public employees, but we can't sell pot either because that's bad. So I guess what I really hope there are public policy sessions moving forward. I would hope you would avail yourself of the expertise of the person who literally wrote the bill, who represents vast parts of this city, who I'm sure would be perfectly open to helping guide you in those deliberations. If you want to know what's in the bill, what better person to ask than the person who literally wrote it? I would have liked to have seen some of that up here too today. But I will say this, most of this is coming whether or not we do anything about it, and thank God for that. But we can kick another industry across the river or somewhere else, or we can take advantage of it in a way that benefits everyone in Peoria. And the choice is really yours. But if you don't opt to do this, I really, really would hate in like another year or two to find out that we have to cut more public services that I use because we don't want to raise taxes anywhere. And we also don't want to quit funding like the Convention and Visitors Board and the Civic Center. I really hope that doesn't happen. Thank you very much. You all have a very good day.
Up next we have Shama St. Louis.
Good morning. Almost after. My time started before I even got up here, but it's cool. All right, so in a city with major revenue issues and in a city that is still labeled as one of the worst for blacks to live, Peoria needs to allow adult use cannabis sales within the city limits. Also, use needs to be allowed in public space as to not unfairly target those who may not have a private space to use. A few years ago, our council made a spur-of-the-moment decision, one that was unfair, to not follow the lead of the state and set an oppressive fine on cannabis use in Peoria. And now this is an opportunity to correct that mistake. Revenue from cannabis sales needs to be used to invest in people in the neighborhoods that need it the most. I believe the mayor stated that we will probably hold more public meetings. I would like to encourage him and the council to absolutely hold more public meetings on a variety of days and on different times on the South End, the North Valley, and East Bluff. These communities have been adversely and disproportionately impacted by previously harsh draconian penalties for cannabis use. A decision about this should not be made, and conversations should not be had without doing the due diligence to include thoughts and opinions from people who have been affected the most. There are not enough people in this room who fit that description. The real reason this discussion is controversial, in my opinion, has less to do about the effects on young people's health and more to do with negative consequences of black and brown people interacting with police. We need to be looking to limit reasons young black and brown people interact with the police. Our state rep, Jahan Gordon Booth, stated in some of her earlier statements that this bill was to serve as reparations and help repair the harm done by the war on drugs over the past 4 decades. Let's not forget that at the heart of this bill is racial equity. It was written through a racial equity lens. Here's the opportunity for Peoria to participate in a way that not only means more revenue for the city, but righting wrongs against black and brown people. I urge this council to allow adult use cannabis sales within city limits and to have limited restrictions on where it can be consumed. Thank you.
Up next, we have Dr. George Gilbert.
Very much for allowing me to speak. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming today, because I do really appreciate the efforts of people to try to do something proactively for our community. I guess I should introduce I'm family physician. I'm additionally board certified by the American Board of Addiction Medicine, and I'm a lifelong Peorian. So I have a lot of admiration for everyone here. And in fact, as people were talking, reminded me of one of my own personal heroes, and a lot of people here too, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who stated, history will look back and not say, why did the few bad people get away with anything, but why did not enough good people step up and do something? And I think everybody here is trying to step up and do something good for our community, and I really appreciate that. And so, another one of my heroes, Mayor Artis, I will quote you as saying, I think a few years ago you said, as goes District 150, so goes Peoria. So I'm thrilled that Dr. Karat is here, and I think that's why I'm here too, is I really want to focus a bit on the youth, and I think it was Councilman Kelly that mentioned this is a public health issue, and so, and I'm glad that you mentioned the age of 25, because that is, current research seems to indicate that the developing brain is susceptible up to age 25. So I think all of us here want to do something always for the youth of our community. And so I appreciate also Chief's points about making police officers more effective within the community. And it was mentioned maybe that we have to reduce people's impact or people's opportunity to interact with police officers, though I think, to quote one of our previous chiefs, policing is done with the community, not for the community, so we're all working with the police. And I think that's why we're here today also. So I wanted to suggest something, obviously that's going to be the case, is that we're all going to have to educate ourselves more and more. And I have a book that I am recommending for all of us, okay, and that's by Alex Berenson. It's called Tell Your Children the Truth about marijuana, mental illness, and violence, okay? So it's the youth population that I think is most susceptible to some of the things that can go wrong with the influence of marijuana. So I will just kind of, I don't have enough copies for everybody, but I will try to work on that because I do think that it would be a helpful thing for all of us to read. So and I think it's especially good for parents, you know, all of us who are parents. We're going to have to be, we've talked about how the city of Peoria may have failed young people or people of color or, you know, any vulnerable population. The youth will be a vulnerable population always. And so let's all of us not fail our own kids in our family and our community, and, you know, and anybody that's in that next generation. And two of us here today, the medical community, we're on this perinatal addiction committee for the Central Illinois region. And I'm glad Councilman Kelly mentioned young men under age 25. But we have to remember young women of childbearing age who are going to be, not just them, but their babies will be affected by marijuana. So we just have to keep that in mind. And I really appreciate what has been mentioned about second chances and expungement and all of those things that I really feel very much in favor for. And I'm just hopeful that we can not forget the people that really are going to be impacted the most. Many of them aren't even born yet. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. Up next, we have Jose Pedraza.
Hello, everyone. As you heard, I'm Jose Pedraza. I am a disabled, I'm going to be brief. I am a disabled Army veteran. I served honorably for 14.5 years. Not all wounds are visible. I was not prepared for my exit from the Army at all. My first 2 years as a civilian, I was taking about 19 pills a day, pretty much sitting on my sofa. I couldn't do much. Didn't have the will to do much. Either way, whether I remember to take the pills or I didn't, they didn't work. None of them did. I then turned to alcohol to try to help out. As needless to say, it didn't at all. It made my family life and my marriage a lot worse. I did a little bit of research on medical marijuana. I didn't have my card, so I did recreational marijuana, and it did help. It helped a lot. I then went to Trinity Compassionate Care Centers and for my options, and I then became a patient. And now I'm happy to say that I am only taking one medication for heartburn, along with my medical cannabis. Oh wow, sorry about that. Since I became a patient at Trinity Compassionate Care Centers, my life has changed tremendously. My marriage is a lot better. We're doing really good. My family life is a lot better. I am now working. If it wasn't for starting the use of recreational marijuana, I would not be here, be able to stand up and talk to you today. And now I am a working, contributing member of society again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Up next, we have Ron DiGiacomo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having this special meeting. I'd like to address council and mayor and staff members in this important issue. I am one of the principal owners of Trinity Compassionate Care Center, and I want to lend my expertise and my staff expertise to any meetings that you might have in the future that you may need some direction, any hearings or anything, we'd be willing to give you any information you need. I do want to talk about a little our expansion plans because we do want to stay in the city of Peoria. Our expansion would probably include an additional 20 jobs we'd have to hire. Right now, the way the state has written the bill, our current medical license where it stands on University Street, we would not be able to move that right now to Councilman Graham's concern about moving into an industrial area. We'd have to leave it there and add an adult use license there. Part of the thing of moving to industrial area too, we've seen this in Colorado. When that happens, a lot of patients do not want to, travel into those areas. They feel more unsafe. So that's just something, to take consideration when you're making decisions where to move these facilities. The second thing is the way the state law is written. We have to contribute about $300,000 in the next year to social equity programs. That means that we can either send it to the state, to their fund, or work with the local city to do some programs, educational programs, maybe work with community colleges, maybe do things of that nature to help train or help keep the citizens of Peoria safe with that money. So we're opening that up for discussion as well, if you can make moves to opt into the program. We also, from a business perspective, have to make decisions, and we have to make them quickly. We'd like to be open January 1st here in Peoria. We understand the timelines are tight. We're looking for maybe special use where we are now as a consideration. So those are the things that I really want to stand up for, say that we will expand here in this city. We run a really, really good operation. No incidences. We'll continue to do that and also work on social responsibility. Because whether it's medical use or recreational, we still all have a social responsibility. And us as an operation have to educate our staff, educate the patients, and the adult use patients coming in that want to learn how to, use marijuana, responsibly. So with that said, I have some staff members here that'll probably come up and talk more about our operation. But again, I'd like to stay in Peoria, but I'd like this council and this chamber to move as fast as possible so we can make some decisions on what we need to do from a business perspective. Thank you.
Up next, we have Stephanie Artheloni.
Good afternoon, Council. I've been a citizen of Peoria since I was 6 years old. I worked at OSF for 15 years in clinical research, and my life changed in the blink of an eye when I was shot in a drive-by shooting in my home. Mayor Artis, you were there for my commencement graduation speech, so you've heard a little bit of my story. I was sitting in my home, and a drive-by shooting occurred and came in my eye and out my nose, and I lost my left eye. And my world changed overnight, literally. I didn't know as a researcher the benefits of endocannabinoids in our system and that we have receptors in our brain that are there for that purpose. And I am also a patient at Trinity, and I am an employee. And so I get to see both sides, a lot of sides that most people don't. I get to talk with patients directly, like myself. And in my personal experience, in the last week, I will share with you that it's been the first time in 2 years that I did not have to sleep with my medication that was prescribed to me by my physician because of cannabis, because I now understand more about the process, the way that it works in our brain, how our bodies are all different. And I have heard testimonies from other patients. I have a woman that was given 6 months to live, and we are at 9 months now, so she's still here with us. She had 12 tumors on her liver, and because of her medical cannabis, they are gone. There is no sign of them on the image on the MRI. So I just encourage you to please keep an open mind about the health benefits. Also, the opioid crisis, it would definitely reduce the instances, because if me as a person, I'm telling you now that my life has changed. I'm standing here in front of you and I'm doing my best to be a citizen. I don't want to be on medication. I don't want things that give me side effects. I just want help for my PTSD, for the shooting, and I want other people to receive the medical benefits of medical marijuana. And I also want to speak to the position of the DUI being classified as the same as smoking marijuana and driving. And I know that currently the DEA is being educated about the difference of a controlled study with 10 drivers who were drinking and 10 drivers who were doing marijuana. Now, I don't have the result. The results were that those using marijuana were not impaired and did not cause an accident or fail the course. Where those that did drink, all of them failed. So I just ask that you would please keep an open mind and think of me when you make that decision. Thank you.
Next, we have Amta Burnett. Oh, Anita. Sorry.
I am the nurse at the local dispensary. I have a very extensive cancer history. This year I get to celebrate my 50th anniversary of survival. I'm a St. Jude patient. Unfortunately, though St. Jude saved my life, they over-radiated me to the tune of about 200 times the lifetime limit. So what that did was they caused me to have additional adult cancers. There's nothing that St. Jude can do for that. It's just part of the process that I went through. So at the age of 40, I had kidney cancer, and I survived that. And in 2016, Trinity Compassionate Care saw my knowledge of cannabis medicine and hired me, and within 2 months, I was diagnosed with liver cancer. So I've also survived that, luckily with the use of cannabis medicine as well as surgery. I can't tell you enough that you do need to learn how this does affect every person medically. We do have an endocannabinoid system within us. We need this medicine. It was taken out of our food chain 60 years ago. That has made a difference in our health. Please consider keeping it more centrally located in town. I don't believe it belongs in some industrial park where the elderly are afraid to enter into. A lot of my population coming in to be counseled on how to use this medicine are 60 years plus. They're not looking to get high. I have many people that want to use the medicine, but their doctors are not on board yet, so they're looking forward to the recreational use. So everybody who is going to use it gets some medical benefit from it. They may not realize it yet at that point. There is the argument about children getting access to it. I tell you what, I worry a lot more what they're getting access to in your bathroom cabinets and underneath your kitchen sinks. And that's what's really going to harm them. So anyway, I'd be glad to help in any way I can, answer some questions. I hope to be with Trinity and help the public understand cannabis medicine for a very long time. And I appreciate you even giving Peoria the opportunity that you have so far. Thank you.
Thank you. I see one more coming. Katie Kim.
Hello, sorry I was a little late coming today. I'm here really to listen to the conversation. As a commercial real estate agent and developer in the city, I've had a lot of clients come to me and ask to find locations and to find areas. And knowing that and hearing some of the comments, it is going into law, it is going to happen, and whether it's a personal agenda or whether you're for or against, I think we have to state the fact that it's coming, it's legal, and if we want to keep, and listening to the public comment as well, keep jobs, create jobs, and keep them here, then let's figure out how we create that opportunity for them. And I know when I was listening, and I've contacted some of the staff to try and help find areas. The warehouse district is right now off limits. There's some areas where we look around the city and it's virtually impossible to locate these facilities within the requirements. And so I wanted to comment to the point of that if we want this within our city, to give us the guidelines, and as a couple of council members said, don't wait. Because these applicants, there's hefty application fees for their application, and they need site control as they do the application, which a lot of times involves signing a lease, putting down deposits, and so it's a big financial commitment for them. And those conversations are happening now, happening around the city, and if we want to keep them, we really need to set guidance sooner rather than later. And so I just wanted to let you know on the commercial side and dealing with some of the entrepreneurs that are looking to go into this business is that they are making these decisions now, and so acting sooner rather than, I know the comment was made of December 31st, would help them and prepare us. And so as we look at the financial benefits for the city, and again, this is going purely on a business standpoint, is we want to make it the social equity piece. We want to make those opportunities available for all of our constituents, whether, again, personally you're for or against it, looking at the legislation, and just wanted to give some perspective that people are looking in this community, and they're looking actively. Thank you.
Brianna McGee.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to touch on my story for a minute. I was diagnosed with lupus, a qualifying condition in the state of Illinois for medical cannabis. I was diagnosed at the age of 16, a time in my life where I'm still trying to really figure out myself and really figure out who I am in this world. And that really impacted my life quite a bit. My doctors handed me a number of prescription medication that sometimes, I didn't really understand what it was or really pay attention to what I was taking. I was just told as a 16-year-old girl that I needed to take this in order to not be in any more pain. It was when I was 21 years old when I was able to apply for my cannabis card and receive my cannabis card in the state of Illinois. And that has made a positive impact on my life in the most great way. I lost my mother in 2017, and at that point, my odds would have been pretty low. I could have lost my home. I could have been out on the streets. It wasn't until I was hired by Trinity to work there, and the job opportunity for me there has been amazing. I've been able to finish school, and I will be graduating, receiving my bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Lincoln College because of the opportunities that Trinity Compassionate Care has presented to me. I really appreciate the environment that I work in, and it's nothing but positive. And that is what we are trying to enforce with our patients and the general public as well. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Danielle Ross.
Hello. I wanted to speak on three main points, and that would be education, revenue, and health. I've been born and raised here in Peoria, Illinois. Been an athlete most of my life. Traveled the state, also traveled the United States as well. And dealing with cannabis, dealing with the history of cannabis in the United States, specifically here in Illinois, what we're doing now, what's going to happen, we do not have a clear perspective as in general. There's so many different avenues, so many different aspects and points, and a lot of people like to use certain words to put on their picture of their perspective, and it's not correct. And as far as education, dealing with cannabis, how it used to be grown before the 1930s in most of the farms. After that, after Nixon dealing with the war on drugs, we have to really look at what's happening. Cannabis is not a drug, it's a plant, grown, period. So when we think about drugs and think about different things, like she said back here, we can go in the medicine cabinet, they can prescribe us at doctor's offices, all of these types of drugs. People are going to work high. They don't test for that. But when you look at the employee handbooks, number 1, right there, it says cannabis. But when it talks about other pharmaceutical drugs, that's like number 4, number 5, or it's not even listed in the handbook. But again, people are going to work every day high, and we're not worried about that. They'll say, well, mention it to us. But who's going to mention that they're high? So we have to really think about that. And even with Peoria, again, born and raised, I was an athlete for most of my life. I had to deal with watching Peoria in the inner cities fall. There's no resources in certain communities. 61605 area, 61603 is dying completely. And yet the Levy District, Grand Prairie, they're building up, they're growing, which is awesome. But what about the inner city? I grew up in District 62, which would be Pleasant Valley, and I was a feeder school of Limestone. So I've traveled, I've lived in different parts of the city, and I don't want to be short. So we really have to look at what's happening, what has happened, and what's happening with our city and what we're going to do going forward. And I really want to focus on health. Like many of these other people behind me, I had to go through an injury. They wanted to do the shots, they wanted to do the surgery, dealing with my lumbar spine. I refused. I had to study. I had to change my eating habits. Medical marijuana did help. It did help. I didn't have to go through the surgeries. I didn't have to take those shots. Because I see people, I talk to people, they've been taking those shots, they can't move, they can't work. Yet we have all of these different success stories from cannabis dealing with that. So I really want us to kind of look, kind of research, look at the history, especially with the war on drugs. We need to go back to Nixon and deal and see what happened with that, with the war on drugs and what's actually happening in our communities. We can talk about the black market. We can talk about that all day long, but what really happened? What is the root of that issue? Not cannabis. I assure you it's not, because the cannabis out in the black market right now, it's actually worse because people are spraying things on it. They're putting things in it, not from what's being grown naturally. They're putting things in it. So we, just as much as they're putting stuff in our food and our water. So we really need to look honestly at what's going on generally, especially for Peoria. I don't want to leave Peoria. I don't want to move my family out of Peoria because there's nothing here. There should be things here. There should be things for our children. And we have to also educate our children. We're not educating them correctly. We know what it is as far as the black market. We know what it is as far as the negative aspect of it, including law enforcement. But we really have to teach them and say, hey, this is a medicine. It's not a leisure activity. It's medicine. And when we teach them the correct way, then we can move forward. Not fighting, we can move forward together, whether you like it or you don't like it, but it's here. Again, as everyone is saying, it is here, so we have to take proper steps and educate our youth and educate the elders because they don't know. They've been misinformed. We've all been misinformed prior to the 1930s of all of this happening within the Industrial Revolution, and all of that. So I just want us to be mindful and to educate each other, educate yourself, self-study, and know that this is possible, this can be lucrative, and we can bring Peoria, we can make it alive again. It's dying. It should not be dying. And then the fact that we have this and we're able to do this and talk amongst all of each other, we can change and we can keep Peoria alive and bring more businesses, bring more people back to Illinois, specifically Peoria. Thank you.
I don't have any additional card comments. Is there anyone else that wanted to address us that hasn't filled out a card yet? Okay. Madam Clerk, do we have an executive session? We don't. Okay.
Could I have one follow-up question for Corporation Counsel based on one of the questions raised? If we don't allow the retail sale, then does that impact the amount of money that we could get for the fund that's set up through the state statute going to economically disadvantaged areas? And if you don't know, if you could give us a report back on that.
Okay.
Okay.
So
thanks.
I'll encourage the council to continue to supply questions for the city manager. I would also ask on behalf of the council that we, it's hard because of the budget work that we're just getting ready to start to, but we do need to put this on somewhat of an expedited calendar. As a lot of people said, a lot of business decisions are going to hinge on what comes back with this, so we can hopefully get the public dates out there maybe next week sometime, and then put a schedule out to how the rest of the discussions are going to roll out. Just as a reminder, all of this information either that we talked about today is either already on our website or will be posted to our website. Our communications director, Stacy Peterson, assures us that that will happen, and we also would encourage continued questions from the community either to come through the council or to the manager's office. With that said, we have a motion to adjourn the public policy session today by Councilwoman Ali and seconded by Councilwoman Jensen. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. This policy session is adjourned. Thank you for your participation.